My name is Simon Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and the night everything changed was October 13th, 2019. People who know Traverse City think they know it. Cherries and festivals, summer boats and sleepy autumn streets that smell like wood smoke and salt when the wind shifts off Grand Traverse Bay. I grew up 50 miles inland, but moved to town for work and for the quiet. I tell you this because the quiet is important to the way the story sits in your chest later on. When a place is famous for its postcard softness, the places that don't belong there stand out like scratches on a photograph. I worked at a small independent bookstore that doubled as a late-night cafe during tourist season. My life was a steady, slow rhythm. Open the shop, stack the returns, make drip coffee, lock up when the last couple left full of pie and conversation. My friends were few but steady. Margot, who ran the bakery 2 doors down, a practical woman with a laugh that sounded like a bell. Benji, a municipal mechanic with an almost childlike curiosity about old engines. And Clara, an EMT who could slice humor through the tightest panic. They all felt to me like anchor points. I tell you their names because you will want to know them when the shape of the night grows larger and attempts to swallow ordinary people. Traverse City, even in autumn, holds on to a particular kind of twilight. The sun seems to admit defeat earlier there, shadows stretching long between the warehouses and the old lighthouse where gulls congregate like a congregation of white-rimmed saints. The shoreline has relics, a rusting ferry ramp no longer in service, a line of boathouses patched together by painters and fishermen, a small park with a bent sign warning of rising water. Locals tell you which docks to avoid after dusk, and they tell you in the same tone they tell you not to walk into the deep woods alone, a casual note folded into everyday instructions, the way one mentions a cracked step. Nobody except a few people could have imagined how specific that warning would become. I was never a man of superstition. I liked facts, ledger sheets, sales reports, the measured weight of a good hardcover in the palm. But there are stories in Traverse City that live in people's mouths the way mold takes to old wood, quiet, persistent, and more real for the way they get repeated. There's the rumor about a collapsed boathouse where someone supposedly vanished in the 1970s, and the talk about a man who drove his truck into the bay one winter and was never found. People joked about having Traverse City eyes, the habit of looking at a shadow twice, of being hesitant on shorelines after dark. A week before October 13th, I had stayed late closing the shop. The bell on the door had given its soft, familiar chime as customers drifted out. Margot had waved from behind a cloud of flour, Benji had shouted something about a carburetor he wanted me to look at, and Clara had texted that she'd be stuck at a call. Alone, I stacked the last of the returns and took the key to my apartment, a second-floor walk-up above an ice cream parlor that smelled like melted vanilla at dawn. On the way home, I noticed a truck parked near an alley by the waterfront, the kind you see anywhere, dented, bed full of tools. But there was something odd. The truck's lights were off, and a single pair of boots stood facing the water like a statue, unmoving. I couldn't tell you then why that small oddity lodged in my chest. Maybe I thought of how vulnerable bodies look when turned away from the street, or maybe I was simply a man who liked to know why. I went to sleep that night with the image of the boots and the bay folded into the edges of my thoughts. I suppose anyone who tells a true story will confess to the little things they filed away. They matter later, like talismans you didn't know you were holding. The days leading up to October 13 had been a slow bleed of weather. Warm afternoons and sudden cold snaps, leaves bruising into russet and gold. People in town were launching final fishing trips, stringing lights for early Halloween parties, and talking about the looming slow season with a mixture of relief and dread. I worked extra shifts at the bookstore because an author was coming for a reading, and the extra hours gave me a strange hunger to be outside at the edges of town once the day was finished. I told myself I needed a walk to clear my head. Clara said, jokingly, that the bay would steal me if I wasn't careful. Benji offered to come along, but had to deal with an engine that kept coughing back at him. Margot left a slice of lemon cake at the counter with a note. "Come home. Don't be a ghost." And I smiled at the curl of ink and left. You will also want to know about the place I chose to walk to. An old jetty on the eastern side of town, past the fishing co-op and beyond the new condos with their glass balconies. The jetty had once been part of a pier that served a load of lumber in the old days. Now it was a place where fishermen swore you'd find the best perch and where teenagers dared each other on the rocks. There were names for the rocks: Witch's Tooth, Old Man's Knee, small, practical things that made the landscape feel owned and knowable. I walked there because I liked to watch the water flatten under moonlight, and because the motion of small waves calmed my mind the way a metronome steadies a nervous hand. All this, the town, the people, the subtle warnings, the boots in an alley, the jetty's bent sign, is the scaffolding. If I do my job as a storyteller, you'll feel the familiarity before the fracture. You'll know the cadence of my days and the face of my quiet life, so when the sound cuts through the ordinary, it will have weight. You'll want to care about the small kindnesses: Margot's cake, Benji's laugh, Clara's texts. Because the larger things that were coming were not interested in kindness, they were interested in disorientation. It was nearly midnight when I left the apartment. The air had dropped, and the bay had that high, metallic smell that happens when cold meets salt. I told myself I would walk only to the jetty and then head back. I told myself these small things in the way you do before a storm, stacking little denials like bricks. I walked past the bakery, past a shuttered arcade with glass fogged from within, and toward the water where the town's lights bled into the dark like a distant, sleepy constellation. The main part of the story, the part that will make you wish you'd listened to the casual warnings, begins there at the edge of the jetty when the normal sounds of the bay shifted and something else stepped into the space between waves and streetlight. I reached the first of the rocks and noticed that the boots I had seen days earlier were not alone. There were prints in the wet sand, too many to be random, and they ran in a line toward the water. I shouldn't have followed them, but I did. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I shouldn't have followed them, but I did. The rocks were slick with algae and the air smelled of iron and cold. Moonlight carved the water into silver scars, and each step I took made the quiet larger, like a hand that kept unfolding. The footprints led past the jetty proper to a narrower spit of rock that jutted into a shallow eddy. The tide there hummed oddly, as if the bay had a throat and it were clearing it. I crouched to see the prints better. They were a mix of boot and bare foot, small and big, as if two people had passed the same path at different times. They ended where the water pooled and the sand took a darker color. There, half buried in the silt, I found something that tightened the skin at the back of my neck, a thin strip of cloth, frayed and stained, tied in a sloppy knot. It looked like it had been part of a jacket sleeve. I hooked a finger under the knot and pulled. The sound that came, a small, wet sucking noise, made me swallow hard. The cloth loosened, and attached was a metal tag on a frayed chain. I read the letters under my breath: E. Collins. The name meant nothing to me then, because names in small towns recycle themselves. Everyone has a cousin with the same initials. But names matter in stories. They root things to people. I slipped the tag into my pocket and kept walking, and that's when I first heard the voice. It didn't come from the shore or from the path behind me. It came from the water, a soft human sound like someone clearing their throat. "Simon?" it said. And for a fraction of a second, my heart leapt because the voice belonged to Benji. Benji liked to play pranks, but Benji's voice wasn't hollow. It had substance and grease and laughter. This voice had a flatness, as if it had already been through several winters. "Benji?" I called, louder than I meant to. The sound bounced back at me, thin and useless. A figure stepped out from behind a low pile of driftwood. At first, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a shadow shaped like a man. Tall, hunched shoulders, jacket dangling. Up close, the face was a smear of wet clay in the moonlight. He held something in his hands, a coil of rope, slick and dripping. For a moment, I thought he might be a fisherman, come back for a lost line. Then he smiled, and his teeth shone wrong, like shells. "You're late," he said. I don't remember the sequence logically. My brain seemed to narrow to a point. I remember my feet refusing to move, the rope's shadow sliding across the rocks, the sound of my own breath like a match struck in a great dark room. I remember the figure's boots had the same pattern as the prints I'd been following. I remember thinking of the boots in the alley, the pair standing like a statue, turned toward the bay. I remember the smell. Not fish now, but something softer like old paper left damp. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice sounded small. He tilted his head. "Ethan," he said. "Been waiting." Ethan. The name fit the metal tag in my pocket without my permission. The man, if he was a man, took a step closer, and I saw that his hands were cracked and cold, the skin flaking like dried glue. The rope was in one hand, in the other something I didn't want to identify. I took one backward step, slid, and held the rock with a palm that stung with cold. "Back up," I said. The command felt absurd in my mouth. "You're not alone. Call someone." His smile widened. "You called me." That was when the sound came from under the water, low and rolling like the groan of a hull. The surface of the bay broke in the small space between us, and something long and dark uncoiled itself from the depth. It wasn't a fish. It moved like rope but breathed like a thing alive. It looped once around a piling and then, impossibly, slid into the rope Ethan held. The two became one. I turned to run because every instinct screamed to get back to light and people. My foot found a slick patch, my leg slipped, my knee hit the rock with an ugly crack. Pain flared, sharp and hot. I scrambled and the world shook with the thwack of something striking the water right behind me. A second figure, a woman this time, emerged from the shadow of the driftwood, hair plastered to her face, eyes like hollow coins. She reached for me and I flinched as if some animal had tried to bite me. "Don't," I said, though who I meant, them, myself, the water, I couldn't tell. The woman laughed, and the laugh was layered with too many other laughs, as if someone had recorded people at different times and spun the recording. "You shouldn't have come," she said, "not since 79. The numbers hit me like a stone. 79. The old story about the boathouse, the missing man. The cold winter when someone, or several someones, were said to have slipped into the bay, and the town had closed its mouth tight around the rumor. I don't know why I tried to bargain then. Maybe men try to talk their way out of impossible things because talking is what they do when threads of control remain. "Listen," I said, voice high. "This is Traverse City. People care. Ethan's hand closed on my shoulder like a vice, and the cold of him felt like winter water seeping under skin. I tasted salt. Beside me, the woman, the coin-eyed woman, pulled something from the inside of her coat. A child's shoe, tiny and mud-streaked, tied with a scrap of ribbon. The sight made my bones go hollow. "You left us," she whispered, and the shoe's ribbon unfurled like a flag. There was a bright, stupid hope at the back of my mind, that this was a prank taken too far, that Benji and Clara and Margot would spring out, laughing, the way people played on docks. But there was no laughter except theirs. The water kept whispering and the rope lay obedient at Ethan's feet. They moved as one then. Not violently, but with an economy that made me understand they had done this before. Ethan looped the rope over a rock cleat, and the coil slid into the water like a snake making its grave. "Come on," he said, and his voice had a softness that felt like a hand on a child's cheek. "We need you to remember." "Remember what?" I asked. Because remembering in small towns was often what a person asked of others, to recall favors, to keep stories straight. I had no idea what remembering meant now. The woman leaned close, breath like river mist in winter. "Where the boat sleeps," she said, "where the wood still remembers the names." She touched my face with a finger that was too cold to be human, and for a flash the world tilted. My head filled with images, a boathouse eaten by ice, timbers groaning, voices muffled under a wet blanket, a little boy's shoe floating like a white heart. I saw the faces of people I had never met but somehow knew. A fisherman with a missing tooth, a woman with a red scarf, a man with a ledger. Names slid past me like fish. "You're not alone," Ethan said again, and this time I understood the meaning. He meant that whatever this was, whatever had been waiting in the bay for years, it collected people. It kept them in a little lit room of the mind and used their edges to scrape at the living. Panic rushed me then, clean and hot. I twisted against Ethan's grip. The rope nicked my palm, the water tugged at the line as if testing new weight. I managed a shove that sent him stumbling. Frozen, he blinked like a sleepwalker. I wrenched free and ran, not toward the town lights now, but away along the rocks, blood on my hand, breath ragged. Behind me, splashes, a curse, a sound like someone struggling with a wet sack. I ran until my lungs burned, until the jetty's lamp smudged into a smear of gold. A siren wailed in the distance, or maybe it was just my own head screaming. I didn't stop until I reached the boardwalk near the bakery where the lights were on and the world had reformed itself into a sensible map. I saw movement at a window, Margot, maybe, or the silhouette of a woman, and I felt both relief and the terrible, childish fear that if I stepped into the light, everything might vanish like a bad dream. My phone read 12:23 a.m. No missed calls, no new messages. I called Clara. Straight to voicemail. I called Benji. Straight to voicemail. I called Margot. She answered with a sleepy, "You okay?" I had to put the phone against my palm and bite down to keep the words from turning to ash. "There's someone at the jetty," I managed. "Something's wrong. You..." Static ate the rest of my sentence. "Simon, breathe," Margot said. "You're scaring me." "I'm fine," I lied. "I hurt my knee. I'm coming home. I should have gone to the hospital. I should have gone to the police and told them exactly what I'd seen." Instead, I walked home with the tag heavy in my pocket and the taste of salt in my mouth, the echo of rope in my ears. In bed, I lay awake and counted the minutes like a man with something in his throat. I thought of Ethan's smile, of the little shoe, of the wet chain with the initials E. Collins. I tried to fold those things into neat categories: prank, mistake, remembered story, and every category slipped like wet glass. At dawn, after a night of trying to will memory into safe corners, I went back. The rocks glimmered in weak light. The rope was gone. The prints had been washed smooth by the tide. The strip of cloth was gone too, but in the sand where the shoe had been, I found a single small footprint. Not mine, not Benji's, and too small to be any adult's. It led to the water and stopped. I picked up the metal tag and looked at the initials. The letters seemed to stare back like a question. I pocketed it again, but this time my fingers closed differently, as if holding something that could not be returned. When I finally told the town what I'd seen, the faces I looked into had the ordinary mixture of pity and skepticism. People asked if I'd been drinking. They asked if I'd been alone. A few old-timers went quiet and changed the subject like a good rule had been broken. Clara hugged me and said nothing, but her eyes were small and hard. Benji came by the shop later that day and clapped my shoulder too hard, his laugh brittle. I knew then that something had shifted in the town's sleep. The jetty held a secret that wanted witnesses, and whatever had been there in the water had turned its attention to me. In the days after, it became clear that memory is not only what people keep, it's also what they pass on, like a contagion. Names started surfacing in odd places. E. Collins in a town ledger, whispered over coffee, mentions of a boat that had listed and been forgotten, a photograph in the Historical Society's archive of a kid with a crooked grin. They told me later that the Bay keeps accounts differently than people do. It remembers names the way an old ledger remembers debts. You don't pay it with cash. You pay it with attention, with the exacting currency of being present. That afternoon, when the bell at the bookstore chimed and someone left a newspaper behind with an article about a found object on the jetty, I felt the weight of the metal tag in my pocket like a promise. The story was only beginning. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After the rope and the little shoe and the cold touch of that woman's finger, things in Traverse City stopped fitting together the way they'd always done. People who'd known me since I moved in started to look at me with that careful, narrowed look you give a neighbor whose dog has started to howl at midnight, a mixture of pity and the hope the problem will pass. I stopped sleeping well. My knee healed, but the bruise on my wrist where Ethan's hand had closed stayed tender, like a place that remembered pain long after the skin had smoothed. I took to carrying the metal tag in my pocket all day, as if the weight of it could be measured in comfort. The first real change was small and practical. Benji didn't show up for work at the municipal garage. He'd texted earlier that day about a stubborn carburetor and a beer. Later, but by noon, his truck was in the lot with the engine still warm and no one around. Some of his tools were grouped neatly in the bed. Others lay scattered, as if someone had walked away in a hurry. His blue jacket was draped over the passenger seat. The last thing that made the hair rise on the back of my neck was how his boots, the same boots I'd seen that first night, stood at the edge of the concrete like sentinels, pointed toward the water. Clara came by the shop, her face gone thin. She'd been on a call, and when she came off duty, she'd gone looking for him. The sheriff had been called. Tom Gallagher, an affable man with a laugh like a dented bell, had taken statements and pretended at a protocol that felt more for his own steadiness than for the town's. People leave for reasons, he said. Problems, anger, trouble. His eyes were kind but unfocused, like someone repeating a phrase to keep their own hands from trembling. I couldn't do the thing the sensible people told me to do, wait. I wanted answers in the sharp way someone wants a bandage, so I did the thing that would come to define me in the following weeks. I dug. Not in the bay, not yet, but in paper, in places where people keep the inconvenient past that doesn't quite match the postcard. Traverse City's Historical Society was a small brick building on a narrow street, and the woman who ran it, Evelyn Park, wore her hair in a severe bun and had a fondness for cataloging minutiae. She liked to think of herself as a keeper of map points where nothing was forgotten. When I visited, there was a box of papers tucked in the back room with the corners of its envelopes browned like preserved leaves. I told Evelyn I was looking into the jetty, the boathouse story, the rumor that had always been folded into the town's talk like a damper on a stove. I told her I wasn't sure what I believed. I only knew the name on the tag in my pocket. Evelyn's expression changed when she saw the initials. She fetched a ledger that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. The handwriting inside was impatient and cramped. Names and dates, a list of people who had drowned, been lost, or simply gone from the town's ledger without explanation. There, in a column of entries from 1979, was E. Collins, missing, boathouse collapse, presumed drowned. People don't like to reopen runouts, Evelyn said quietly. They forget because remembering means responsibility. Responsibility. The word felt like a stone in my throat. I thumbed through more pages and found other names that seemed ordinary enough. A dockhand, a teenage caretaker, a salesman who'd been passing through, and then a notation in the margin, Boat Marigold, salvage incomplete, parts missing. The notation was dated late November, 1979. What was the Marigold? I asked. Evelyn folded her hands. A small tour boat, had a capacity for 12, got caught in an early winter storm. The town tried to move on. The town told itself stories to get past storms. It was a skill here to retell and tidy and swallow trouble like bitter pills, but paper insisted on telling what the living didn't want. Records showed a half-finished salvage, a ledger entry about an unpaid crew, and a later postcard with a black and white photograph of a boathouse patched up in haste. Someone had penciled a child's name on the back. The child's name was smudged. When I left Evelyn's, the day had dimmed, and the sky had a bruised color that looks like the inside of a mouth. I walked the shoreline because the thought of being indoors felt more dangerous than being out. The jetty looked smaller that afternoon, as if the harbor itself wanted to compress the memory and hide it. I stood where the rocks met the water, and for the first time in weeks I let myself remember the way Ethan had smiled. There was madness in his soft voice, but there was also a hunger that felt ancient, like the appetite of a place that had been unpaid for a very long time. That night, Benji's truck was still at the garage, but Tom Gallagher called off the search with a shrug and a note about jurisdiction. He suggested we assume Benji had gone to visit family or had taken off to think things through. People need reasons that make sense, he said. What made sense wasn't what was happening. The next morning, a fisherman hauled up a tangle of rope from his net and found a child's shoe caught within the knots, the same make as the one the woman had pulled from her coat at the jetty. The shoe's ribbon had decomposed into a pale line. It had been in the water long enough to forget color. Rumors are greedy things. They show up at every bar and bakery and spin until the facts inside them are shredded. I stopped going to the bakery, except to pick up sugar for coffee because Margot's eyes looked like she'd been holding back something. Clara started staying later on calls and told me, in a voice she used when she bribed a child with a promise, to stop looking alone. Let people help you, she said. Don't be a hero in this, Simon. But heroes and protagonists are luxuries. The feeling that the bay had marked me, put a metal tag in my pocket like an IOU, made me reckless. I began to dream of timbers and of the marigold listing like a wounded animal and of a small frightened face caught in a fray of wood, The dreams weren't dreams so much as memories that didn't belong to me. I woke with salt in my mouth and with the image of a ledger open to a page with my name scrawled across it in someone else's hand. Then, 1 week after Benji's disappearance, I found the first sign that the Bay wanted witnesses. I was sweeping the shop when a man I didn't recognize drifted in, thin, with a camera slung over his shoulder and eyes like a man who keeps lists. He said he wrote for a regional magazine and had heard about unusual occurrences in small towns. He asked questions in a way that made me think he'd done it before. Where I'd been that night, what I'd seen, what the tag looked like. He showed me a photo he'd taken in the harbor that afternoon, a black and white image of the boathouse, its timbers eaten by mold, with a name scratched into the corner of a post. It was my handwriting. I'd never been to that boathouse, not properly. But there in the photograph, someone had captured the rough indent of letters I recognized from my childhood, SB, and beneath it, another set of letters, newly carved, wet and dark. The cameraman looked at me, and his voice had the same small, terrible care as everything else had taken on. People around here like to carve things to mark time, he said, but sometimes the sea keeps them for us. When I told Clara and Margot, they went pale and looked at the windows as if expecting something. The sheriff, when I pressed him about the carving and the photograph, said he would check it out and then didn't. The way the town shuffled responsibility felt like a cover, not the passive kind, but the active one. People pushing their worst fear into a corner and whispering, "Not our problem." That night, I drove out to the old boathouse on the edge of the inlet. The place smelled of damp wood and something older. Moonlight made the planks look like ribs. My flashlight beam caught a square of carved letters on a beam near the entrance. There, scored into the wood and still dark with greenish rot, were letters I recognized like a fingerprint, SB, and below it, freshly cut and bleeding like a raw sore, the letters, Benji. My voice failed in my throat. The world narrowed to the groove of the letters, to the understanding that being a witness had a price. I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, and in the beam of my flashlight, something moved behind me, a wet shadow peeling away. I didn't run this time. I couldn't. I stood there, a small man under the bones of a collapsed story, and felt the pull of the water, like the promise of a ledger being balanced. Somewhere in the dark, someone whispered my name. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The boathouse seemed smaller in daylight and monstrously large at night, like a thing that only took its true shape when the town had gone to sleep. After I found Benji's name carved into the beam, I stopped pretending I could disentangle myself from what was happening. People can pretend for a while. That's the useful thing about small towns, but pretense wears thin when the ledger calls a balance due. Clara refused to leave me alone after that. She came with a bag of gear, practical as ever. Flashlights, a coil of thicker rope, just in case, and a handful of those medical wipes she liked to use like talismans. Evelyn came too, which surprised me. She had the same bun, but her hands trembled when she set a battered book on the hood of my car. Tom Gallagher showed up last, more out of obligation than belief, carrying a flashlight that made his shadow too big for his body. Evelyn opened the book where the ledger had been cryptic before. Nestled beneath lists of names and dates was a slim, brittle notebook, not town records, but handwriting that looped like a tired river. It read like a set of instructions folded into superstition. Find the name, find the tag, return the tag where the timbers sleep. Speak the name aloud with your own name as witness. Offer your memory as ledger. There was the language of old fear, and beneath it, a note in a different hand. Only one may balance a debt. Balance a debt how? Tom asked. His voice was light to hide how much lighter his hands had become. The implication was a ledger literalized, a town owing what it had refused to remember. Maybe it meant return the items to the wreck, Clara said. Put names back where they belong. If we can, Evelyn said, and her voice cracked. If we can find the marigold. The marigold had never been fully salvaged. That much the records made clear. It sat, half swallowed, out beyond the jetty, a memory in the water and a shadow on the map. We piled into my old pickup and drove out where the harbor opened and the moon painted the bay in silver. The town's lights stood behind us like candles. The water ahead was blank and patient. We tied lines to a skiff and pushed off, the motor whining like a throat clearing. The skiff rocked gently. The world narrowed to the beam of the flashlight and the breath between us. Clara kept looking back the way people do when they try to hold fear at bay with constant witness. Evelyn read from the notebook under the small map of a wooden hull. Tom tried to keep his voice steady and failed. We found the Marigold by the ragged teeth of its cabin roof, a silhouette of broken ribs. The hull lay low, but where the timbers rose, they caught the moon and showed us the scars of decades. I climbed first and felt the wood give under me like the skin of some old animal. The inside smelled of salt and old rope. It smelled of something else too, something like iron and old stories. Under a loose plank, half wedged and cruelly neat, I found a handful of metal tags, names stamped into tarnished brass: E. Collins, M. Rowe, T. Larkin, a roll call of vanished people. The tags were attached to thin chains that had once been fastened to life jackets or the rim of the skiff. Beside them lay a small, mold-soft child's shoe. Clara touched the tags with a reverence gone wrong. "We bring them back," she whispered. "We read them. We tell them who remembers." Evelyn read the ritual aloud as if it were a prayer. Find, speak, witness. When she came to the line that asked the reader to offer a memory, she looked at me as if she expected me to take the weight. Maybe she did. Maybe when you are the one who first noticed something, life expects you to finish it. Maybe that's the way small towns work. The one who sees becomes the ledger keeper. We did the ritual because not doing it felt worse. We set the tags on a plank and spoke the names one by one, voices thin in the dark. E. Collins, M. Rowe, T. Larkin. At the last name, the bay sighed and the skiff rocked as if a great hand had passed beneath us. We dropped the tags back into the water where the timbers sank and watched the little tongues of metal catch the moon and then go dark. When it came to offer a memory, the hard line in the ritual, no one moved. The notebook's margin warned that memory was currency. Evelyn's eyes found me. "You were there first," she said. "You saw the boots. You found the tag. If anyone has to, I shouldn't have agreed, and yet I did." There are decisions that feel less like choices and more like falling into a necessary shape. I told them the memory I feared to hold, the way the water had called the rope into itself and the sound of someone laughing soft as a child's voice in a closed room. I offered my memory as the witness line recommended. My name, my clarity, my refusal to forget. "Then speak your name with the names," Evelyn said, and her voice had a finality that felt like a bell. I said it. "Ethan, Margot, Benji, E. Collins, and I, Simon Brooks, remember you." I felt nothing at first. The bay lapped the hull like a patient mouth. Then the water moved wrong. Small whirlpools, eddies that smelled of old paper and rust. Under the skiff, something rose. Not a hand, but a thing like a ledger leaf, wet with history. The sea took our offered names and folded them inside itself like a gem swallowed into black velvet. Ethan's face, the man I had seen at the jetty, appeared again, only this time there was less menace and more hunger. He stood on the far side of the Marigold, rope in hand like a conductor with a baton. "You gave us witness," he said. "That's the debt paid." "Then give us back the people," Clara said, voice small and furious. "Give us Benji." Ethan leaned forward as if to be close enough to whisper. "Names return. Names change hands," he said. "Someone must stay to carry the ledger." My stomach hollowed. The ritual had been a balance, not a release. The water wanted not just acknowledgement, but someone to bear the remembering. Otherwise, it simply drew new lines again. The idea was not mercy, it was bookkeeping. "Not me," Tom said, and his voice was a thin bark of denial. "Not me," Evelyn whispered, but her hands were already slack. The choice felt inevitable as tide. In that heavy moment, the bay made sense. Cold arithmetic turned to myth. It wanted a keeper, someone who would walk the stones, count the tags, keep the names from being erased by convenience. The ledger had to be held, and the town's old bargain insisted on a witness who could not forget. I thought of Benji's laugh, of Margot's bell-like voice, of the little shoe bobbing like a lost heart. I couldn't stand the idea of them being letters in a water-bound book with no one to say their names. So I stepped forward. I offered myself the way you offer a coin into a slot machine, hoping against hope. "Take me," I said, "if that's what ends it." Ethan's smile folded like the tide. Balance accepted. Hands, soft, cold, like river cloth, reached up from the water and touched my ankles. For a panic-laced second, the world insisted on being ordinary. The cold, the rope tugging, Clara grabbing my arm. Then the cold rolled faster and my feet slid. I didn't scream. Sound blurred to the hum of water and the whisper of timber. Clara jerked and swore, and for a heartbeat, I felt her fingers on my wrist like a promise. Evelyn chanted the last lines from the notebook, and Tom shone his light so bright it flayed the dark. For a second, the world seemed to hinge on those thin efforts, like a breath held between thunder and silence. Then the bay took me. It wasn't like drowning as I had imagined, more like being unstitched from the world. Names rose around me, not voices but impressions. Benji's oily laugh, Margot's flour-dusted hands, Ethan's crooked grin from a different life. I felt them all fit themselves to me like clothing. The tags in the marigold pinged like small bells as they sank, and I understood what balance meant. To be the thing that remembers, to feel every small notch in the ledger at once, to be both witness and entry. When Clara and the others pulled back from the edge, the skiff rocked empty. They called my name until the sound cracked. The surface smoothed as if a hand had passed and smoothed a bedsheet. In the light the next morning, there was no trace on the water, but a small drift of rope and a single metal tag, clean and new, with letters stamped carefully into it. SB. People find ways to keep going. They told a story about me that made sense. Simon Brooks, volunteer at the library, went out to the marigold and didn't come back. They held vigils. They carved my initials into a beam. The town did what towns do. They tried to tidy the ledger and walk away lighter. But a ledger unheld will find a hand soon enough. The jetty is quiet at night. The water keeps its accounts. On my street, at the edge of a dresser drawer, I used to keep a small brass tag on a chain, a habit from when I used to collect oddities. The tag is gone now. In the boathouse, the beam where Benji's name was carved bears a new, small notch that the light catches wrong. When people ask Clara now about what happened, she looks at the water and says nothing. Evelyn still catalogs, but the ledger in her office has a fresh entry, written in a trembling hand. Witness. New. And sometimes at dusk, when the harbor lays itself flat and the gulls stop their complaining, you can hear a new voice at the jetty, not quite local, not quite stranger, counting softly like someone reading names into a book. I don't know if what I did saved anyone for good. Memory is not a lock you close once. It is a hinge you oil with attention, and sometimes the hinge needs a hand to keep it from rusting shut. The last thing I remember before the water arranged itself was the feeling of a name. Not mine, but borrowed, bright as a coin, settling into my palm. If you ever walk the rocks at Traverse City at night, keep an eye on the water and the brass that sometimes clinks on the sand. If you find a metal tag, read the name aloud as if giving someone a place to rest. Speak it clearly. Someone somewhere will be listening. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Lucas Finch. I was 28 years old when it happened. October 13th, 2018. Say that date out loud and most people think of superstition or a joke. Around Traverse City, they say the date like a warning. I didn't go to Traverse City looking for trouble. I went because my life in Cleveland had narrowed down to fluorescent lights and deadlines, and because my sister insisted I take a long weekend somewhere with water. I found a small rental on the edge of West Bay, a clapboard place with a sagging porch and neighbors who kept their blinds half closed, even in August. The owner, an elderly woman named Ruth Halloway, handed me keys and a list of rules like favors she'd done 1,000 times. Don't leave the gas on, lock the shed, don't walk the marsh at night. She smiled the way you smile to an ignorant traveler, like she was delivering gossip and not advice. There were 3 reasons I picked that cabin. First, the bay was quiet and the air had a steadiness I'd been missing. Second, I wanted to walk the Sleeping Bear stretch. The dunes and the cliffs, the way the woods smelled like pressed pine. And third, I liked the idea of a town that kept its history. I'd read about old fishermen's tales and lighthouses that had a reputation for making grown men uneasy. I wasn't thinking about ghost stories, I was thinking about silence. I met 2 people who would keep appearing in the story of those nights. Mason Price, who ran the diner at the corner of Front and Union, and Ruth's grandson, Tommy Vale, who fixed things for a living and had the look of someone who'd grown up on the water, weathered skin, hands that knew rope. Mason was talkative in that way that tries to fill gaps left by strangers. He'd drop a plate of biscuits on my table and ask why a city boy picked Traverse City in October. Tommy was quieter, more like a presence you only noticed when something was wrong. Both of them warned me in different ways about certain places to avoid after dark. Mason laughed it off a wink. Tommy looked at me as if the answer mattered for my safety. The town itself felt like an old photograph. Brick storefronts, faded signs, fishermen's nets hung like curtains in shop windows. The tourists were gone. The season had wrapped up. That left locals in the kind of hush that comes right after the last bus leaves. There were also the whispers you only hear if you ask questions, a kind of civic memory. Stories about a man who used to wander the bluffs, about lights that bobbed on the water long after the ferries stopped running, about a house at the end of Old Bingham Road that no one visited because the people who used to live there were said to have left in a hurry. None of these were meant to be invitations, but I took them as atmospheric details instead of warnings. I told myself I liked the isolation. My apartment in Cleveland had been full of other people's lives projected on screens. Here I had the chance to think unbroken thoughts. I walked the shoreline, coffee in hand, watching gulls like punctuation marks on the horizon. Sometimes I'd sit for hours in a chair on the porch with a battered paperback, letting the wind untie the knot in my chest. At night, I'd hear the bay breathing, a low, rolling sound like someone shifting in sleep. It was calming in a way the city never was. On the second day, I found a journal tucked beneath a loose board in the rental's porch. It was a shocking thing to find because it felt like trespassing into somebody's lived life. But the handwriting was faded and the entries were dated decades earlier. The pages spoke of small things, a man named Ellis who mapped weather patterns, a reference to a ferry captain, and one crossed line that mentioned the Watcher at the point. It was the sort of detail that lodges itself in your head without you meaning it to. I photographed the pages and told myself I'd look into them online when I got back, proof-hungry and rational. The local librarian later told me Ellis had been a part of town records, a scientist of sorts who kept odd hours at a research cabin on the bluff. Not everyone liked him, she said. Not everyone liked what he did after dark. There was a rhythm to the town. The diner's sizzle in the morning, a thrift shop opening at 9, the metal gate at the old pier clanking when the wind was wrong. The sky changed its mood quickly across the bay. Silver, then fierce blue, then a tilt toward low, gunmetal clouds. On one of my walks, I passed a cluster of houses where the paint peeled like old scabs. A boy on a porch kicked a tin can and called out to me, curious about the camera slung around my neck. He told me there were people who kept to the marsh because they liked things quiet. He didn't elaborate. He never does when the thing is local and dangerous. By the time the 5th night rolled around, I understood that Traverse City was a place that made the darkness feel like it had memory. Not because there was anything supernatural, at least that's what I told myself, but because the town was built where people had to be vigilant. Rocks, currents, tides with a will of their own. I kept my lights on long into the night. I locked the doors when I wasn't thinking about it. I even kept the porch light burning at odd hours, an affectation more than a precaution, a small rebellion against the way the long nights closed in. And then there was the fog. It arrived without fanfare on that last night, the kind that comes off the bay and fills the street like a pale hand. The fog doesn't move so much as it floods. It carries sounds the way a sieve carries water, muffled over and under everything. I remember thinking the fog would be romantic, cinematic, the sort of moment you'd make a photograph of and then go back inside to warm your hands. I didn't know how much the fog would take with it. It wasn't until after midnight that things began to fall into a pattern I couldn't explain. The radio in the kitchen kept drifting to static, then a fragmented voice that sounded like it came from another year. Shadows moved at the edge of the windows in a way that didn't match the trees outside. Once, standing at the sink, I caught my reflection, and for a heartbeat it didn't match where I felt I was, like someone had rearranged the room while I blinked. I told myself fatigue creates illusions. I told myself not to be dramatic. The sound that woke me was a name. At first I thought it was the wind. The fog carried a loneliness that turned ordinary noises into something personal. Then the whisper threaded through the kitchen window again. Lucas. My name, in a voice that was close enough to my ear to make my skin tighten. Not shouted, not urgent, but like someone testing whether I would answer. I didn't get up at first. I lay there, the mattress underneath me, recognizing the weight of my chest, listening for the house to approve or deny what I'd heard. The kitchen light was the only point of pale in the room, a square on the far wall. The whisper came again, and with it a feeling like a tide rolling in, inevitable and soft. I rose on legs that were heavy as winter and padded toward the window. The fog had turned the world into a watercolor. Shapes lost their edges and bled into one another. Down on the shoreline, the old pier was a silhouette, and somewhere beyond it a light blinked. Not the steady warning of a lighthouse, but a pulse like someone signaling in Morse to no one in particular. There was a figure on the beach. That's where the story begins proper. Not with the warnings or the little eerie facts, but with the moment the figure stepped out of the fog and into something that felt like the center of the world. I could see the outline of a person, tall, hunched as though carrying a weight across the shoulders. They made no sound as they moved, and yet each step seemed to bend the night toward them. Up close, it wasn't clear whether the figure was a man or a trick of light. The thing that made me move, though later I would wish deeply I hadn't, was the certainty that the voice had called my name from there, from among the rocks and the shallow water. I grabbed my jacket. The house creaked as I opened the door. The air hit me like someone's breath, cold and smelling of wet earth. The fog wrapped around me immediately and my street lamp vanished as if snuffed. I took the path toward the beach, each step a punctuation in the damp. When I reached the sand, the figure was closer and a new sound threaded into the hush, the faint rhythm of someone humming, a tune I couldn't name but recognized as the kind that belongs to old things. The figure turned, slowly, and for a moment the fog wore the face like an ill-fitting mask. Then the figure stepped forward and the sound of the water changed to something that could have been words. I realized, with a cold that had nothing to do with the October air, that I had no idea who I was following. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I moved toward the figure because my brain had already decided there was an explanation. A fisherman, a lost tourist, maybe even Mason playing one of his practical jokes. Up close, the shape kept its anonymity, a coat heavy with salt, hair plastered to a skull, a cap pulled low. The humming stopped when I took my first step onto the sand, as if whatever was singing had folded itself away when I approached. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse in the fog. "You okay?" The figure tilted its head. For a fraction of a second, the outline looked like any ordinary man, someone who'd fallen asleep on the rocks and wandered when the tide turned. Then it turned its face toward me, and the fog treated the face like a screen. Features emerged as if projected from behind the mist. Eyes like pale coins, skin the color of old rope, no recognition there, nothing human enough to read. "You shouldn't be out here," it said. Not my name this time. A sentence calm and flat, like someone reciting a fact. "Neither should you," I answered, ridiculous in retrospect. I wanted to laugh to cut the tension, but laughter felt like dropping a bowl. The beach held its breath. "I live here," the figure said, "or I used to." "Who are you?" The question sounded louder than I wanted. For a moment, the figure only looked at me. Then a hand, long-fingered, the nails dark, reached into the coat and produced something. A scrap of paper, curled and wet. It held it out like an offering. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looped and single-lined. Even from a distance, I could make out the words scribbled on it. "Do not wake him." The fog swallowed the scrap as if it had never existed. The figure shrugged and then, with the casual indifference of someone dismissing a trifle, turned and walked toward the water. The moon, which I hadn't noticed behind the cloud cover, silvered the back of the figure. It moved with a gait that ignored the pull of the tide. I followed, because whatever logic had me on that one-way path wasn't interested in my consent. My feet sank into wet sand that smelled like iron and old shells. The boardwalk behind me disappeared between waves of mist. The pier's light, previously blinking like a distant heartbeat, flickered and then went out. The figure stood at the edge of the water, where a dozen small rocks jutted like teeth. It stared into the bay as if waiting for something, and then slowly it dropped to its knees. It looked like a man praying to the sea, though there was none of the human posture of supplication about it. More like someone folding themselves to become less important to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Who's him? I asked, though the question felt absurd in the face of that quiet. The figure didn't respond with words this time. Instead, it took both hands and dug into the sand, fingers scraping until a hollow appeared. It reached inside and pulled out a small metal box, rusted but solid, like something that had been made to survive storms. The box had a latch shaped like a compass rose and a piece of seaweed tangled around it. When the figure opened the box, it was empty, except for a sliver of mirror and a folded photograph. The photograph, black and white, curled and water-stained, showed a group of men on a cliff. Young, laughing, arms slung over each other's shoulders. I could make out one face in the front row, a man I had seen in the pages of the porch journal. Ellis, unmistakable in his tilt and the way his hair fell across his forehead. Behind them, a lighthouse blinked, and there was a small wooden structure on the bluff. I felt my pulse in my throat. Ellis, I said before I could stop myself. Is that Ellis Kincaid? The figure's head nodded once. He used to come here, the figure said. The voice had a way of scraping the inside of my skull. He used to listen. He used to watch. Sometimes he wrote, and sometimes he listened back. Listen back to what? I asked. The question crawled up from somewhere that was neither curiosity nor courage. Voices, the figure said. The water keeps talking. The cliff keeps telling. The town listens and pretends not to. People like to pretend. It smiled then, a thin, wet motion, and for the first time, the face looked almost young. He stopped pretending. Ellis. The name landed with the weight of a key turning in a lock. I remembered the journal entry about the watcher at the point and the librarian's quiet insistence that not everyone liked what he did after dark. I had thought of Ellis as a town anecdote, a character in an old man's yarn. I hadn't realized those old tales had teeth. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because you came, the figure said simply. Because you were called. Called. The word made a reed-thin sound in the fog. I thought of my sister prodding me into the trip, of the way I'd taken a detour to the porch and found a journal as if someone had been waiting to make me curious enough to look. The scrap of paper, "Do not wake him," burned in my memory like a hot coal. The figure closed the box and pushed it back into the sand. He used to sit on the point and count the lights, the figure said. He said the lights were answers to questions you hadn't asked yet. He would follow them until they followed him back. You mean Ellis died here? I asked, because I needed the story to sit somewhere solid. Dead things are easy to map, the figure hesitated. People think so, it shrugged. But the tide takes many things. Sometimes things go where we cannot go to find them. A sound reached me then, not from the water, but from the bluff above, a slow shifting like someone moving furniture. I looked up toward the trees that edged the beach, and in the faint clearing of the fog, I saw a small light moving between trunks. A flashlight, bobbing, steady. It was human and wrong at the same time. Tommy, someone called from the top of the path. The voice was Mason's, clipped with alarm. Lucas, you all right down there? Relief was sharp enough to hurt. I had wanted company, and here it was, cheap and noisy, and exactly what I needed to break the spell of the figure on the shore. I cupped my hands and shouted back, "Yeah, I'm fine," as if saying the words made them true. The figure watched me with something like pity. They will call you back, it said. They always do. Tommy's flashlight shone down the slope then, a narrow cone that picked out the figure's shoulders briefly and then flared over where the box lay. For the first time, I noticed the tracks in the sand. 2 sets of prints, one leading away toward the water, the other leading nowhere, stopping abruptly, like someone had been pulled upward. Lucas, get up here, Mason's voice commanded. Now. I walked up the path with Tommy and Mason waiting at the top, faces pale in the flashlight glow. Mason planted his hands on his hips as if to anchor the world. Tommy didn't speak, just took my jacket and folded it into something practical. You okay? Mason asked. He smelled of grease and too strong coffee. No, I admitted. But I think I saw... Nothing, Tommy said. He held out a hand and then, against better judgment, pointed down to the sand. The small metal box lay half buried where we'd left it. The photograph had gone. The mirror lay at an odd angle, reflecting nothing but the gray of the fog. Mason swore softly, "We should go back." As we climbed away from the shore, the fog seemed to sigh like a hinge closing. Behind us, the figure rose from the sand and walked slowly into the water until it vanished beneath the low, indifferent chop. When the last outline disappeared, the bay returned to being only water and sky. But I had seen what I had seen, and the scrap of paper and Ellis's photograph burrowed in my mind like a secret I was now responsible for holding. I realized, as we reached the porch and Ruth's lamp buzzed in the window, that something in Traverse City had decided to invite me into its memory, or its grievance, and it would not let me go without giving me choices I had not expected to make. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The next morning felt like a concession, the kind of day that gives you light and expects you to behave as if nothing had happened. I didn't behave. I brewed coffee in a hand-shaking, too-quick ritual, and Mason watched me like a man appraising a scraped car. Ruth made us breakfast with the efficiency of someone who'd seen strangers and storms both. Tommy said little, but when I glanced at him, his jaw was set like knuckles around a secret. "You sure you want to poke at old things?" Mason asked as he slid a plate of eggs in front of me. "This town eats curiosity for breakfast." "I have to know who Ellis was," I said. Saying his name made the room smaller in a way I hadn't expected. And why someone would leave a note, "Do not wake him," by the water. Tommy's fingers tightened on the mug so hard the ceramic creaked. "There's history with that point," he said finally. "People used to go up there and write. People used to think they were only writing to the weather." "Writing to what?" I asked. Tommy didn't meet my eyes. "Depends who you ask. Some say the cliff spirits. Some say the currents answer those who listen long enough." He shrugged like he didn't believe any of it. I suspected he was lying to himself. I spent the day in the library. The librarian, Elsie, a woman with a cardigan that seemed stitched from town records, slid me a stack of old newspapers like contraband. Ellis Kincaid's name appeared in town minutes in a clipping about a lecture he'd given at the community center, once as a credited observer in a boating accident, and later in a whisper, "Ellis missing, last seen at the point." Dates were annoyingly precise. June 17th, 1987, the year people tended to attach to other losses. One article talked about a research cabin on the bluff where Ellis had measured electromagnetic fluctuations near the shoreline. Another described how a small group of men, fishermen and local odd jobs, had complained about lights appearing in the water at odd hours. One letter to the editor called Ellis obsessive and dangerous. Another, signed by a name I didn't recognize, begged locals to leave the bluff alone. I took photographs of the clippings and the journal pages I'd found. There was a neatness to the way the town left fragments of itself on paper, as if history could be reduced to glue and type. But the edges of the story frayed whenever I tried to knot them together. Names clashed, dates hesitated, and Mason's easy smile looked like a mask for a man who'd learned to keep certain evenings to himself. That night, I walked the bluff with the photograph from the metal box burned into my vision. The wind had teeth. It pushed at my jacket as if trying to redirect me. I climbed the ember-brown path that led up from the beach and paused where Ellis had once had his cabin. The structure was gone now, nothing but a foundation and a scatter of nails. Someone had carved initials into a splintered post, EK, and something I couldn't decipher. I sat on a rock and watched the water. The bay was a black sheet folded into itself. The pier was a toothless silhouette. Somewhere below me, waves whispered secrets they apparently wouldn't keep. "You really gonna do this, Lucas?" Mason's voice came from behind me, close enough to startle me, but not so close I could pretend I hadn't heard him arrive. "You came," I said, turning. "Why are you here?" "Because I don't like the way things disappear," he said. His face was all angles in the moonlight. "And because I thought if you were thinking about poking something that might bite, you shouldn't do it alone." We talked there for a while about everything and nothing. Mason told me about small, practical fears, the tide and rust and a ferry schedule, and then he said something that made his voice go thin. Ellis liked to leave things in the tide pool, little offerings. He believed the sea answered him. Folks thought he was eccentric. Eccentric is a town's polite word for dangerous when the dangerous thing keeps showing up at odd hours. I told Mason about the scrap of paper and the photograph and about the figure who'd given them to me. His face went still. "That paper's a warning," he said, "not to wake what's there. That's old superstition. But superstitions have a way of being practical." "Practical how?" I asked, because sometimes people sleep on the wrong side of the line. He tapped his temple with a knuckle, as if words didn't need to be precise. "Some people follow lights and never come back. Sometimes the ones that come back aren't the same. My folks avoid mentioning them because it makes trouble look like a story." I wanted to push him for specifics, names, tragedies, the shape of the thing that might wake, but Mason only shook his head. "You could look into the county records," he said. "See who disappeared. See who was found. But be careful with the names. Some things are memory's work and they don't like to be disturbed." That night, I dreamed of the photograph. In the dream, the men were laughing in the way men laugh when they believe they own the horizon. Ellis was in front, his hand on a small metal box. They were all lit by a light that had no obvious source, and beyond them, the cliff opened like a mouth. I woke before the picture tasted like anything I could identify as safe. Over the next days, the town tightened in ways that felt personal. People I'd spoken to earlier became more reserved. The librarian gave me a look that suggested she'd given me too much already. Tommy rode by on his truck a dozen times, always looking at the bluff, as if expecting the shoreline to rearrange itself. I started to find small things. A bottle half buried at the edge of my porch with a note inside that read, in a hurried hand, "Leave it alone." Another night, a car idled at the corner for a long time, headlights smeared by fog. When I went to the window, there was no one there. Every little sign was a finger tapping on glass, and then Ellis began to visit in person, or close enough to make me think he had. Not the pale-faced figure on the beach, him, in chunks and gestures. I'd find at random objects on my doorstep that hadn't been there before, a small compass, a coil of old rope, a scrap of a sailor's chart. Each of them smelled faintly of seaweed and machine oil. Each item made me inhale sharp and hard. I kept asking myself what I could do with a story I hadn't asked for. I could record it, write it down, hand it off to someone who would file it under oddities, or I could follow it further, climb toward the mouth of the cliff and see what had been buried there. There's a point in a story where curiosity feels less like a tool and more like a magnet. The question isn't whether you're drawn to it, it's whether the draw is an invitation or a trap. I decided I'd climb the bluff again that night because decisions have a way of appearing simple until they take you somewhere that's not a town record. I told Mason and Tommy where I was going. They both tried on different faces of protest, the jokey, the firm, the uncomfortably real. And at the edge of the path, they gifted me a brass lantern that hummed like a small animal. I held it like a promise as I walked up, the beam cutting a cone through the fog. The night smelled like iron and old rain, and I felt with a peculiar clarity that when you walk into a place that's been kept secret for long enough, you start to understand why secrets prefer the dark. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The lantern trembled in my hand like something alive. The foundation of Ellis's cabin lay ahead, a ring of broken stone and the ghost echo of steps. The fog had a mind of its own. It pooled and thinned and slid away like hands moving over a table. I could feel the town below, a few lights like eyes watching from distance, but up here it was only wind and my breath and the slow sound of the bay breathing under everything. I found the box where the figure had dug it up, half buried under a mossy slab, latch eaten through by salt. My fingers shook as I lifted it. The mirror inside was gone, but there was a strip of paper folded tight and a new photograph tucked beneath it. A picture of Ellis alone at the cliff, staring out with that same odd, intent look. On the back of the photo, in cramped, careful handwriting, was a line I read twice before my brain nodded it into meaning. He answers the wrong name. The journal was there too, the pages clumped together like wet leaves. Ellis's handwriting ran like a river along the thin sheets. Observations, numbers, the rhythm of someone mapping an animal he thought of as physics. Toward the end, the entries changed. He wrote about a light that did not blink in the river, a pulse that answered questions asked aloud. He described trying to listen without asking, and at the bottom of the last page, in a hand jagged as a torn rope, he had penned, "Do not wake him." Then, below that, a single sentence in different ink. "If he wakes, give him a name he knows. Give him yours." I read those words so many times the paper blurred. The wind pressed at my back as if impatient. The bay answered with a sound that might have been a name whispered through algae. I told myself to leave. I told myself the town had its rules and its blanks for a reason. But the part of curiosity that is like a splinter had lodged under my skin. The figure had given me a scrap, and it had said I had been called. The line in the journal, "Give him a name he knows," sat in my head like bait. From the path below came the voices of Mason and Tommy. They climbed up, breath shorn by the cold, each with a flashlight and the kind of silence that means a person is holding back something heavy. Mason kept glancing at the box like a man making decisions about whether to open a door he'd rather leave shut. Tommy's jaw was set. There was a look there I hadn't seen before, a lineage of people who do the hard, ugly things so others can walk away. "Don't," Tommy said when he saw the journal clutched to my chest. It was less a command than a plea. "Too late," I answered, which was true and not true. The pages already had their teeth in me. He wrote, "Give him a name he knows." What does that mean? Mason's face was thin in the light. "It means a name will answer. That's not metaphor." He swallowed. Ellis thought the current was a language. He thought if you supplied a word, the bay would respond in a man's terms. It worked for a while. Small things, lights, the tide behaving. Then things changed. We were three foolish men at the edge of a cliff that wanted to pretend it didn't remember. The fog thickened as if something below had inhaled. From the rocks came the faint percussion of water and a sound under it that was not water at all. A low cadence like someone reading from a ledger. "Say nothing," Tommy said suddenly. "Not a question, not a name. Don't." He didn't finish. The sound rose like a pressure around us. It made my ears ring and my teeth ache. Then, impossibly, there was a voice under the fog, patient and huge, as if the sea itself had shaped a mouth. It spoke a word that was almost a name, a sound meant to wake whatever slept down where light becomes rumor. My skin prickled. I realized with a cold clarity that whatever voice it used would answer the voice closest to it that night. Ellis had thought supplying names would be a key. He'd been right in the small way that terrifies. Names are doors. They call things to the threshold. I remembered the scrap the figure had given me. "Do not wake him." I remembered the photograph and the journal's last line. I felt every small choice I'd made as if they were steps on a path I could not unwalk. There was only one thing left to do, and it was the worst of the options. "Tommy," I said, and I heard my own voice as if someone else had opened a shutter. "Give me your name." He looked at me like I'd asked him to stab me through the heart. His hands were steady, the way a man's hands are when he's decided a thing must be done. "It won't help," he said. "Maybe it will," I whispered. "Maybe we can give it a name it already knows, and it will go back to sleep." Tommy's face crumpled. He looked at Mason, who had been trying to find the physics in folklore and wore a brave man's mask that night. Mason's jaw moved. "There are stories," he said, voice breaking, "about a bargain, a watcher, a person who stays to keep the tide polite. It's always one of us, one who volunteers or one who's tricked. If it takes a name it knows, a name tied to it. Sometimes it." He didn't finish either. We were standing in a place where sentences stopped. Tommy sighed, a sound like the creak of a boat's hull. "It can't be you, Lucas," he said. "You came here by accident. You can leave and tell the truth the town won't want. Let me." "No," I said. It was a strange, animal refusal. I realized I'd been prepared for the choice my whole trip without knowing it, whether to bear witness or to pass the weight on to another. My thumb brushed the paper in the box. I could hand it back down the cliff and run, and everything would go on as it had, with someone else watching the line between normal and not. Or I could step away and be the one who left with the story, the one who called it by name. Tommy's shoulders hunched. He looked at the sea and then at the path below, where the town lay like a set of small lights. "I can do this," he said. "My family's been watching the point for generations. They pass it through names. I can." "No," I said again, and this time my voice had found a stubbornness I didn't know I owned. "I can't leave knowing someone else will be buried by this. I can't leave and call it a lesson." For a heartbeat, he stared at me like he saw the future of the cliff unspooling between us. Then he moved like a man who's already decided the shape of sacrifice. He took the journal, flattened it into my hands, and for a split second I saw in his face the map of every evening he'd spent checking lights and listening for the wrong words. "Then give it a name, he said. "Give it yours, Lucas." I don't know why my name felt like armor that night. Maybe it was the reckless honesty of youth, maybe the need to own what you brought on yourself. I stood on the cliff's lip and said, slowly, so the fog could register it, "Lucas Finch." The response wasn't immediate. The sea didn't shout. Instead, the fog folded and the world tensed. Then from below came a ripple of lights across the bay, small and patient, answering like a clock. The land hummed, and for a moment it felt like the weather itself was considering whether names were the sort of thing you give away. Tommy's face went white as the tide pulled at the rocks. He reached for me as if to pull me back, and then, with a steady breath, he stepped forward instead, into the hollow where Ellis had sat. Mason cursed and lunged after him, but the path swallowed Tommy's boots up to the ankle, and then his knee, and then, with a sound like a small door closing, he was gone, the fog folding over the space where he'd been as if he'd never existed. We called his name until our throats were raw. The fog kept its edge. The bay returned to indifferent beat. Mason and I stood there, shaking like two trees after lightning. The journal in my hands felt heavier. Inside, someone had scrawled an extra line in a different pen, one that was neither Ellis's nor mine. "The watcher takes the tide's answer, so the town can sleep. Do not waken what does not wish to be known." Mason put his hand on my shoulder, and it felt like a plea and a condemnation at once. He said nothing more about Tommy. In the morning, we found a smear of footprints heading toward the water and stopping at the place where the rocks broke. No other trace. Mason left the town the next day with a bag and a face like someone who's chosen a different exile. I left Traverse City with the journal under my arm and the sound of the bay in my ears. The story I tell is not full of triumph. It is full of trade-offs. Tommy's family still live on the edge of the town. I have seen them since, and they look at me with an odd combination of gratitude and accusation. They carry their silence like a badge. People ask if I believe in ghosts. I tell them I believe in the weight of water and what happens when people listen to it too long. I believe in names. I believe in the way a town can keep a thing in its history by pretending not to, and that sometimes pretending is cheaper than truth. When I close my eyes, I can still hear a soft counting under the sound of the tide, the kind of counting that is patient and old and indifferent. Sometimes, late at night, I reach for the phone and think of dialing Mason or Ruth or a man who used to hum on the beach. I don't call. Some things once named keep a claim on you. This is what I learned. Curiosity opens doors. Sometimes the right answer is to let what sleeps sleep. I left a piece of myself there on the bluff in the way a man leaves a footprint. I will never be able to say how much of me the sea kept. But I can tell the story and perhaps make a small difference. Maybe someone will listen and choose differently. Maybe not. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 29 years old, and the incident happened on October 12th, 2019. I tell you that not because dates make things truer, but because the calendar keeps facts orderly when memory threatens to spill into rumor. Traverse City held me like a photograph in a dusty frame. Beautiful edges. A scene you could hang on a wall and forget how cold that October night really felt. I was living in a narrow rental above an old bakery on Front Street, a place with creaking floorboards and a landlord who left jars of honey on the windowsill for tenants he liked. My job was simple, maintenance at a lakeside inn on West Bay. It paid enough for coffee, a beat-up truck, and the occasional beer at Buckley's, where the regulars always argued about sailboats and summer crowds. I wasn't a man of many people. My closest friend was Mark Whitlow, a high school pal who now ran a bait shop down by the pier. Mark had a laugh like a busted bell and believed in two hard things: the right hook of a fishing line and the absolute nonsense that the old lighthouse was haunted because someone once lost a wedding ring there. He introduced me to people: Claire Jensen, a late-night bartender who preferred to call herself a storyteller, and Sheriff Tom Bannister, who'd known my father in high school and owed me a few favors because he liked that I fixed things around the edge of the county. There was also Lena Ortiz, the inn's manager, a woman with a ledger and a patient frown who could make a reservation and a scolding in one breath. Traverse City, in the days before the incident, had the rhythm of a town that could be trusted to stay small. The streets smelled of pine and deep-fried dough, and the Boardman River ran like a ribbon through town, carrying leaves that had nothing better to do than drift. October brought tourists for the color, and then they left. The lake's wind sharpened, evenings tucked in earlier, and the inn's wood stove became our confessional, where guests would talk too loud about marriages, jobs, ghosts, anything to fill the pause between flames. People in small towns carry histories like quilts, patched, visible at the seams. There are stories everyone knows but pretends they don't. Old houses with sagging porches, a tree with our initials carved in it, a wrecked boat someone swore shouldn't be touched. I knew those things the way fishermen know the wind before it changes. I knew where to avoid a pothole at night. I knew whose steps creaked in the night and whose didn't. I knew that neighbors would watch your porch light and that Sheriff Bannister would show up with a thermos if the weather took a turn for the worse. The inn where I worked had its own small mythology. Built in 1892, patched and painted, but still mostly honest, it had a third-floor room that no one booked in colder months. Guests called it the Maple Room because of the view. A stand of sugar maples that turned the slope into a bonfire every October. The room had a worn brass bed, a window that looked out toward the Old Mission Peninsula, and a closet with a door that stuck in winter. No one could remember why the owners left it vacant when the snow came, but everyone agreed that something about the shadows in that corner of the room made people wake hungry and anxious. Lena told me to fix the heating one afternoon in late September. "Just a check," she said. "People get nervous when it goes off, even if it's nothing." I climbed the narrow stairs and pulled the thermostat from the wall. The maple room smelled faintly of peppermint and old paper. There were guest logs folded in the drawer beneath the window. A child's doodle, a heart with initials, a note that said, "Came for the light, stayed for the moon." Little human things, little human pinpricks that made the place feel less lonely. I met Abby at Buckley's. Abby Morris, who taught third grade and ate pie like it was a misdemeanor. She had a camera slung on her shoulder and a soft way of correcting my bad puns. The town liked her photographs. She shot faces and chairs and the way sunlight hit the pier at dawn. People said Abby's pictures had patience. I liked her because she noticed the small things I tried to hide from myself. All these characters drifted through the first days of October like leaves, and it's important you meet them because when the strange things started, they were the ones who pushed and prodded at facts, who found the logic or the lack of it, and who had to live with whatever answer we came to. I was turning 30 in a few months and felt the strange urgency of that number, like it could either destroy or redeem the quiet life I'd been living. The repairs at the inn were supposed to be a line on a list, another checkbox before winter set in. I worked with my hands and believed in bolts and heat exchangers. I did not believe in ghosts. If something felt supernatural, it was because someone hadn't read the manual. By the time the lake turned a gunmetal gray and the tourists thinned, rumors had threaded through town in a way that made them impossible to ignore. Folks in Buckley's talked about doors opening on their own in the maple room. Some said they heard a man whistling beneath the windows at night. One of the summer staff swore they'd seen footprints in the frost leading to the room, then disappearing like ink in the snow. Lena shrugged these off as drafts and imagination. Sheriff Bannister promised to post an extra patrol on slow nights. Mark laughed and sold candles as a joke, but his hands were steady, even in the dark. I told myself to keep things practical. Fix the heater, check the wiring, keep the guests comfortable. I fix things because when something needs fixing, someone has to. That's how I came to be in the Maple Room on the night of October 12th, carrying a toolbox, a thermistor, and a stubborn belief that the truth was less interesting than rumor. I went to work thinking I would close up, tidy the place, and go back to my small, manageable life. The main story, what actually happened that night, starts where those small preparations end, where the hum of the town falls away and the wind over West Bay picks up like a threat. It begins with a noise I couldn't place, and with a choice to ignore it. It begins with a door that was shut when I was certain I had left it open, and with a shadow that seemed to move from the corner of my eye into the bed. I tell you now, the rest of that night was not logical in any sense I had learned to trust. It is the part of the story where simple tools and common sense were inadequate. It is the part I am not proud of, and the part I will not forget. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. You told me to say next, and so here we are, back in that small, drafty room where the night thickened like syrup. After the thermostat and the guest logs, after the mundane rituals of thumbed screws and tightened bolts, the world narrowed to a single sound, a slow, deliberate creak from the closet. I froze on the stepladder, my toolbox at my feet like an afterthought, the kind of creak you get from old hinges, except hinges don't breathe. I told myself it was the wind. The town was full of quiet apologies like that. The maples outside clicked in the gust and the lake pressed its chest against the shore. Still, the creak repeated, once, twice, with an interval that felt almost conversational. I put my hand on the closet knob and found it cold, though the rest of the room was warm from the stove. Cold is honest, it announces itself. Cold means something is different. When I pulled the door open, there was nothing but the wardrobe's stale air. A row of hangers, an old moth-eaten coat that smelled faintly of cedar, and the folded quilt the owners kept there for late arrivals. I laughed at myself, because that is what you do when fear wants to be polite. I shut the closet and went back to the heater. The wiring was fine. The pilot light flickered as it should. I tightened one loose bracket and then heard it. A whistling, low and off-key, coming from the bed, as if someone had tucked a mouth to the pillow and decided to make music. Abby had once told me that sound can carry memory. That night, the whistle carried a tune I couldn't place, like a lullaby that belonged to a house rather than a songbook. It slid along the rafters and pooled in my chest. I told myself to leave. I almost left. I left the ladder, grabbed my jacket, and reached for the door, and then the light above the bed snapped out. Dark is clumsy and does not respect your plans. I thumbed the switch. Nothing. I fumbled for my phone and the flashlight came on like a reluctant eye. The beam found the brass bed, the quilt, the window with the moon gone behind clouds, and then it landed on the place where the whistling came from. There, folded at the edge of the pillow, was a small, pale envelope with my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. I don't know why I don't throw my hands up in these moments. Maybe a man is just stubborn. I picked up the envelope. The flap was sealed with wax, not the red kind you see in movies, but a gray, almost ashen wax that flaked when I pressed it. Inside was a single Polaroid, and despite all the ways images have betrayed me before, this one was sharp. It was a picture of the maple room, taken from the doorway I was standing in, but the bed was occupied. The photograph showed me asleep, face turned toward the window, mouth slightly open. There was a hand resting on my chest that wasn't mine. It was pale and too long-fingered with dirt under the nails. I remember the exact thought, that this must be a joke, some elaborate prank. Mark was the kind of man who could stage a scare like this. Sheriff Bannister had the moral authority to pretend like he didn't. Claire told stories for tips and would have laughed at the money it would fetch. I flipped the photograph. On the back, in the same ashen ink as the name on the envelope, was written a single line. He doesn't wake the same way he went to sleep. My stomach turned like a key in a lock. I called Mark. His line went straight to voicemail. I called Abby, and she answered in a sleepy, bright voice that made me ashamed of waking her. "Ethan, it's 2 a.m. I told her, haltingly, about the envelope and the picture. She said she'd be down in 15, like me, as if that were the most reasonable thing in the world, and she hung up, promising to bring coffee. People who know you bring coffee. People who don't know you expect you to be practical. While I waited, I paced. I turned the radio on, a soft static behind which the hosts at a late-night station discussed the merits of different pies, and I tried to subject the photograph to facts. The camera in the photo was not mine. The angle was slightly off. The bedding was the same. The quilt creased in my hand the same way, but the timestamp printed at the bottom of the Polaroid was wrong by 1 minute. It read 2:01 a.m. The clock on my phone read 2:01. Whoever took that picture had either an extraordinary sense of timing or something else had bent the minutes. Abby arrived with steaming cups cradled like small moons. She parked at the curb like the town had been her waiting room all along. When she stepped into the maple room, her jaw flattened, and she made the same small, practical noises I make when a thing is too big to be figured out right away. She photographed the envelope, she turned the picture over, and then she did something I didn't expect. She sat on the edge of the bed and said simply, "Ethan, show me everything you did tonight." So I told her. I told her about replacing the thermostat, about the creak in the closet, the whistling, the light going out, the envelope. When I finished, silence sat between us like a guest who had overstayed. Abby took my hand and looked at me with a calm I had forgotten existed in the world. "We call Sheriff Bannister," she said. "We show him the picture. For now, no one sleeps up here. Not tonight." Sheriff Bannister arrived with a thermos and a flashlight that had seen better winters. He listened like a man who had kept his skepticism polished for decades and then misplaced it. He took the photograph with reverence, as if it were paper and not a lie. He walked the room, he tapped the window, he looked at the closet door and nodded to himself in a way that suggested he'd been given a puzzle but not yet the right pieces. "He didn't take it," he said finally, more to the room than to us. "No prints on the envelope beyond yours and whoever folded it. No camera on the premises that matches the angle. Door was locked from the inside. I checked when I came up." He didn't say how he'd gotten in. He didn't need to. I felt smaller under his quiet. We posted a patrol that night, and a couple of the inn's long-term guests agreed to move into the common room. The maple room remained empty under the watchful eye of a rotating flashlight. That should have been enough to quell the town's appetite for the strange. But rumors have a long reach and a hunger that ordinary measures cannot tame. Over the next days, more envelopes appeared. Not just at the inn, but tucked into mailboxes, left on kitchen tables, slid under the office door at Lena's. Each contained a Polaroid, each taken from an impossible angle, each showing someone asleep with a stranger's hand. One photograph showed Claire asleep on Buckley's bench, a hand over her heart. Another showed Mark in his bait shop back room, the line spool open on the table, a hand over his throat, as if to listen to the sound of breathing that didn't belong to him. The town's jokes curdled into fear. People spoke in whispers and stopped telling the tall tales they used to exchange like trading cards. Lena locked the maple room and put a small brass padlock on its closet. She told me not to go up there. She told everyone not to go up there. But you know how it is. Locks make a place legally forbidden and practically irresistible. I kept thinking about the phrase on that first Polaroid, "He doesn't wake the same way he went to sleep." What did that mean? Was it a threat, a prophecy, a description? We tried to reason it away. We checked cameras, we tested the locks, we set tamper alarms. Nothing could account for images that seemed to shift time itself. And beneath all of it lay a question that felt both private and communal. If something can take a snapshot of a sleeping man and fold something else into that frame, what did it want from him? Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the photographs multiplied, the town stopped treating them as pranks. They began to organize themselves into patterns the way frost arranges on glass, delicate, inevitable, and impossible to reverse. People who had once smiled at my jokes stopped smiling altogether. Some crossed the street to avoid me. Others left notes on my truck that read things like, "Be careful," and "We saw you last night," with a question mark that held more accusation than curiosity. Sleep became an unreliable currency. I started keeping a notebook by the bed, a ridiculous old-school habit Abby liked because she said it made the night accountable. I wrote the time I went to sleep, the time I woke up, the little details a man might cling to when his life felt like a story someone else was telling. The entries were honest at first. 11:04 p.m., heater fixed, light out, envelope on pillow. Then they started to read like a stranger's handwriting. 1:13 a.m., walked to pier, smelled salt, picked up ring. I didn't remember walking to the pier. I didn't remember anything like that. But the next morning, my boots were wet in a way that could not be faked. Tidal grit ground into the soles and a smear of something on the heel that I had no business explaining away. Sheriff Bannister watched me with a patience that had turned into something thinner, like an old halter that no longer fit. He ran prints, ran my blood for drugs, ran the camera footage from the inn's common area, and found 10 minutes where the feed simply ceases, black frames, then a cut to the morning light. In those missing 10 minutes, nothing should have fit, but it did. A Polaroid left on the coffee table, curled from the heat of the radiator, showing me sitting at Buckley's with a glass untouched and a pale hand over my shoulder. I stared at that picture until Abby took it away and told me to stop doing that to myself. The town, which had been patient as long as nothing cost them, started asking questions that made it clear whose sympathy had weight. "Are you sick?" whispered the landlord who left honey. "Are you doing this to yourself?" asked a woman who mended quilts at the market. Friends who used to call every week for trivial reasons stopped calling. Mark, who ran the bait shop, was the only one who still left a six-pack on my stoop sometimes, and he did it without looking me in the eye. I refused to be a mystery. If something wanted to use me as a note in its hand, I would at least try to turn the page on it. Abby brought over better gear than the inn had: a small DSLR, a motion sensor recorder, infrared. She set everything up facing the bed and the window, and then she did one more thing that mattered to me more than she could know. She slept in a chair in the common room with the camera app open on her phone like a guardian. "If anything tries to get you," she said, trying to joke and failing, "it gets me too." That night, the recorder captured what rationality could not easily file away. The video showed me sleeping, face slack, breathing even. At 2-3 a.m., I sat up without waking, my body moving before my memory did. I walked to the closet and, for the first time, the camera caught something that didn't look like me. The infrared showed a smudge of black leaning into the doorway as if it were a person folded into itself. The smudge did not have clear limbs, and yet it cast a shadow the camera could not explain. It moved with me, close enough that the pixels smeared together like ink bleeding on paper. I opened the closet and took an envelope. The hand that folded the envelope appeared as a white after-image in the footage, longer than my own fingers, not quite there. Then I walked to the window and stood, breathing the air on my face, and the footage jittered, as if the camera had been looking away for a beat stored in the wrong part of time. When Abby slowed the video and replayed the frames, her face did something I had not seen in her before. It broke into a kind of holy fear. "Ethan, that hand," she whispered. "Look at the way it passes through the fabric. It's not touching it." We took the footage to Bannister, and he watched it the way a man watches a road he must drive. He made a deliberate choice in that office, the kind of decision that men in uniforms make when they want to give hope that something sensible will follow. He organized a watch, had deputies take shifts outside the inn, and he told Lena to padlock the maple room. It felt like a victory to make a list and tick boxes. But lists do not catch everything. A week later, I woke to find a Polaroid on my kitchen table with a photo of Sheriff Bannister asleep in his patrol car, hand near the radio, breath puffing in the cold. He had never been in that car that night. He had been at his wife's bedside with the flu, as his log confirmed. The note on the back of that Polaroid read, "He doesn't wake the same way he went to sleep." The same phrasing as the first one. The same ashen ink. It was a message and a pattern and a thing that refused to be a coincidence. The sheriff's stoicism frayed, then mended into something sharper. He came to me that morning with the look of a man who has decided to stop explaining and start acting. "If someone is staging this," he said, "they're good." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The implication left the room colder than any draft. Our next move was a reluctant one. We went looking for the past. Abby and I took the Polaroids, the recorder, and old guest books from the maple room and went to the library. In the archives, we found a clipping from the late 1940s about a man named Mason Greeley, who had worked on a lighthouse on Old Mission Peninsula. He was accused, in a town paper sort of way, of disappearing after his fiancée, a woman named Ruth, went missing one October night. The article suggested an argument about a ring, a storm, and a boat that never left the dock. The facts were thin, more rumor than record, but beneath them was a broken memento, a single photograph browned with age of a small hotel, possibly where the inn once ran a boarding room, and a man in the doorway whose face had been scraped from the print with some sharp tool. Someone had deliberately removed his image. A hand, perhaps, had tried to erase him from memory. There is a peculiar cruelty in history. Sometimes the past is not content to stay in its own time. It migrates and borrows and then comes back to collect. We felt that as if the town itself had inhaled and now exhaled with ghosts attached to its breath. The Polaroids stopped being just evidence. They were a summons, each one a quiet request for me to remember whatever had been taken out of me. I could have pretended I was fine. I could have let Bannister close the file for lack of leads and return to fixing heaters. Instead, that night, armed with Abby's camera and the stubbornness Mark had taught me, I climbed the narrow stairs to the maple room and stood in the doorway with the envelope from the first night burning a hole in my pocket. I opened the closet and found, folded beneath the quilt, something I did not expect to find. A small, rusted ring, no larger than a pinky, with initials scratched inside. The initials were RG. I pinched the ring and felt the cold of history on my fingers. The town had told itself a story about a ring someone had lost. Now the ring was in my hand, and the story wanted me to believe that possession means something more than owning. Possession can mean being possessed. Outside, the wind from West Bay took up the tune again. That same off-key whistle. I swallowed, the ring cold in my mouth of memory and fear, and felt the room shift as if the floor itself were remembering how to make space for the impossible. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The ring in my palm felt colder than it had any right to be, like the last breath of someone who had been dead all winter. I held it up to the window and watched moonlight skim its rusted edge. RG. It could have been a dozen names, but Mason Greeley fit the grain of the story too neatly to ignore. We had the clipping, the scraped photograph, the missing minutes on the recorder, and a town that was tired of pretending. Those were facts, not faith. Facts can be bargained with. We decided to end it where it probably began. Old Mission Peninsula is a sliver of land that juts into the bay like a finger pointing to nowhere and back again. The lighthouse there had been remodeled into a private place by then, but the old dock and the wrecked boathouse were still public enough for late-night trespasses. Abby came with her camera. Mark brought his flashlight even though he swore he didn't need one, and Sheriff Bannister drove us as far as the county line would allow before he turned back to keep the town safe in his own way. The boathouse smelled of algae and rot and the kind of ozone that precedes a storm. I carried the ring like contraband, like an apology. We found the small boat, half sunken, ribs showing like teeth, and at the bow a place where someone once had carved initials and small vows. The notch in the wood matched the size of the ring. I thought of Ruth and the story the clipping hinted at. A quarrel, a ring, a boat that didn't leave the dock. I thought then, with a childish clarity, that if a story is tangled, sometimes you have to return the loose end to where it came from. I slipped the ring onto the heavy, rotting rope that tied the boat to the piling, and for lack of better ritual, I dropped it into the water. The lake took it with a small, polite sound, as if it had expected the gesture and only pretended surprise. For a breath, the world seemed to hold itself together. The whistle of wind in the reeds stopped. The boat creaked like a man settling. We waited. Nothing happened. The absence of immediate retribution felt like relief and like a trap. Abby lifted her camera to photograph the ripples, to memorialize the small victory, and the flash threw everything into stark lines. The boat, the dock, our faces. When the light faded, there was a new photograph in the camera's tray. Abby froze first, her fingers still on the shutter. The picture showed the boat, empty water around it, and someone standing at the stern. A man in a dark coat, hair wind-blown, looking like he'd stepped out of an old photograph. His face was clear enough to see the hollow at his jaw, and his eyes were the color of old lake glass. He looked older and younger at the same time. "That's him," Mark said, a small thing of a voice that was half accusation and half grief. I knew, because I'd seen the clipped photograph in the library, the scrape where a face had been removed. This man had been erased from those prints, and now, somehow, he had found a way back into edges of our lives. He didn't speak. He tilted his head at me like a man recognizing an old debt. The air tasted metallic. I felt something clench inside my chest, a muscle that remembered how to be afraid. "Mason," I said, because names matter in ways stories teach you. They call across years, and sometimes the wrong thing answers. The man did not flinch. His mouth opened and closed without making sound, and then, in a voice that filled the dock like a rumor, he said my name. It wasn't a voice from the present. It was layered, like someone had stitched together 100 nights, and stitched in a voice that had learned to speak through other throats. "You carry what was left," he said. "You walk while I wait." Abby stepped forward with her camera raised and then lowered it like a cross. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than I felt. He looked at her with something like amusement. "To be seen," he said. "To be remembered. To remember." There it was, the ache that had threaded through the Polaroids. Whoever, whatever, had been making those images was not taking people to hurt them. Not exactly. It was borrowing them for memory. Mason had been erased from the town's photographs. Someone had rubbed him out as if he were an embarrassment. In that absence, he had become a ghost who learned to inhabit the edges of sleeping men until the town's face included him again. I held myself like a man offering up his life for inspection. "Take the ring," I said. "Take it if it's yours. Take me if you must. But stop leaving pictures. Stop waking us into other nights." For a breath, Mason looked like a man who had been waiting to hear honest things. He reached out a hand, and the air around it quivered like heat over asphalt. His fingers hovered over my outstretched palm, and for a moment I had the absurd thought that I would feel nothing, that this would be like a handshake, a transaction. Instead, when his fingers closed, a cold like winter spread from the base of my skull down my spine. Memories poured through me. Not mine, but stitched into the edges of my life. I saw a lighthouse lamp swinging, a laughing woman whose face I couldn't then place, a ring slipping from a finger into a hand that wouldn't hold it. In that instant, the phrase from the first Polaroid made a kind of sense that wasn't tender. He doesn't wake the same way he went to sleep. Mason had found a way to fold himself into sleeping men. He stitched his history into them, and for a time he borrowed their waking life. He called it remembering. I called it theft. I might have run then. I might have beaten at the water or shouted for Bannister or thrown myself to the waves. Instead, with Mason's hand tentatively in mine and memories blooming like bruises across my mind, I did the hardest thing I had learned from hard years. I told him a true story. Not the kind you tell to impress, but the bare one. I told him about small things that anchored me. My father's laugh, the way Mark's fingers smelled like fish, the exact scrape on Lena's ledger. I told him my name and where I'd been born, and a single stupid memory from childhood of stealing an apple and how guilty I felt. I offered nothing clever. I gave him roots, and I gave him a living voice that did not belong to a photo or a borrowed hour. Maybe it was the ring. Maybe it was the honesty. Maybe it was the simple human law that the forgotten ache to be named. Mason's face shifted. He was less a figure in a doorway and more a man who remembered being alive. He let my hand go and stepped back, and for the first time since anyone had described him in print, he nodded as if apologizing to the dark. "Remember me right," he said. "Not like a joke on a page, not like a smear to erase." I thought of Ruth. I thought of the town's clumsy attempts to forget. The Polaroids had been his way of getting a proof of being seen. We had been giving him a mirror made of fear. We didn't know what to do next, because the world doesn't hand you clean endings. Mason turned and walked into the shallow fog over the water. He didn't sink alive or die again in some neat cinematic way. He simply walked until the light took him and the dock could not hold what he was. We stood there, three of us, the small band that had carried the town's oddities into a place of action, watching the ripples flatten like breath returning to a sleeping chest. The Polaroids stopped. They didn't vanish like a curse lifted. They just ceased to arrive. Sheriff Bannister put the file in a drawer and slid it shut like he had done what he could. Mark came by with a six-pack and pretended not to notice the way my hands shook when I held mine. Abby printed one last photograph, a picture of the boat mocked by moonlight, and taped it to the inn's bulletin board with a small note, "Remember." I kept the ring, or rather, the ring kept me. It sits now in a small wooden box on my mantel. Sometimes I take it out and feel the cold that is not quite gone, a reminder that memory is a thing that can be stolen and a thing you can return. Sometimes I wake with a fragment of someone else's dream on the edge of my mind, like a half-remembered tune. Those hours are my own now. I own them the way a man owns his mistakes. The town's jokes came back slowly, like spring returning to a long coast. People smiled again in Buckley's. Lena stopped locking doors out of fear and did it out of habit. Sheriff Bannister stopped making patrolling a public ritual and returned to the quiet competence that had always been his comfort. We all learned the same small lesson in different ways. To remember people properly is to keep them from becoming tragedies. If you're asking whether I'm the same man I was before the envelopes and the Polaroids and Mason's hand, the honest answer is that I'm not. Pieces of other nights settle in me sometimes like moths, and I unroll them and see what they contain. I tell their stories to myself like one more stitch in a long and warm quilt. I work the same. I love the same. I worry like the same small-town man who remembers to turn off the pilot light. But the ache of that October night lives in the hollow of my jaw when the wind gets right, and sometimes I find myself whistling a tune I don't know the name of. If you ever find yourself in Traverse City in October, walk the pier at night and listen for a whistle that doesn't belong to any boat. If you hear it, remember that someone once asked just to be seen. That might be enough to keep a small town from forgetting the people it has nearly lost. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Gavin Thorne. I was 28 years old when it happened, the night of October 14th, 2019. Listen close. If you know Traverse City, you know the sky opens to the bay and the streets fold into orchards and sleepy neighborhoods that pretend they don't remember the weird things in the dark. I grew up on the east side, near a crooked road called Twin Pines Lane, where the maples lean like old men in church. I worked at a small boat shop by the Boardman River and fixed motors and listened to fishermen tell their stories. You learn a lot about quiet towns from the things left unsaid. The house with the curtains always drawn, the car in the driveway that never moves, the park bench with a name carved into it. I wasn't the kind to stir trouble. Friends called me Steady. Tommy Briggs. No, wait, that's a name you wouldn't like. Sorry. My name is Gavin. I kept my head down, paid my rent, dated a woman named Marla Keene for a while, drank too much cheap beer on summer nights, and read crime paperbacks when the snow fell hard. Marla worked nights at the Bayside Diner on Front Street and had a laugh like a disputed radio station. Sometimes it came in clear, sometimes it faded until you had to guess the next word. We argued once about whether the city lights were far prettier, reflected on the bay, than the stars. She said the lights hid things. I thought she was being dramatic. She was right. Traverse City isn't all orchards and postcards. There are pockets where history sits heavy. Old logging roads, cellars dug in wartime that people now use for storage, and houses built with basements that remember children who grew up and never left. There's an old mill near Holloway Street that closed down in the 70s. Kids dared each other to go inside at dusk. Grown folks warned them away like you warn a dog before a thunderstorm. Some places seem to exhale only at night, and that's when the town changes tone. Characters color a story more than scenery. My boss, Eamon Pierce, small and quick with his hands, could coax a stubborn outboard back to life and tell you how he fixed his marriage with a single truth, admitting you were wrong 10 times faster than you needed. Eamon's wife, Loretta, kept a garden that fed half the shop in summer. Then there was Sheriff Cole Danvers, tall, county-badged, always a little damp like he spent too much time out in the rain, who knew the town's rhythms and also knew which parts of it were knotted. People like that make you feel safe until the day they don't. On the afternoon of the incident, I remember the sky had that uneasy clarity of early October, blue but thin, like the air might snap. The farmers were bringing in the last of the apples down Old Mission Road. Tourists still trickled through, snapping photos of the bay and asking where the best pie was. The business of life continued. But there had been talk that week in the diner about a string of strange thefts. Garage doors left ajar, bicycles gone from porches, a boat found floating half submerged with no owner in sight. Theft is one thing. It sharpens your sense of the perimeter. It makes you check locks twice. It unsettled people, but we shrugged it off as the kind of petty crime that happens in a town that swells with visitors. The sheriff promised extra patrols. That made everyone feel better for a while. There are little oddities I could have ignored. The boardwalk lights by the marina that flickered in a certain rhythm, the paperboy who kept missing the Wednesday route and then showed up 3 days later like nothing had happened, the woman in a faded navy coat who walked the same circuit every evening at dusk and never acknowledged anyone. People notice these things and then forget them because to add them up would mean admitting something's off. You only say the word off when you can point to it. Otherwise, you live with the prickle at the back of your neck and call it intuition. I used to take late walks along the Boardman sometimes to clear the shop grease from my hands and the noise from my head. The river has a patient voice. It tells you stories if you let it. I learned the faces of the town, the high school janitor who hummed like a broken pump, the 2 retired teachers who walked 2 dogs and spoke of Europe as if it were their second home, and a handful of fishermen whose friendships were as constant and private as scaffolding. I liked that constancy. It made the world seem manageable. The people who seemed most solid were the ones you could trust to remember your name and also the way you liked your coffee. They were the ones who came over in winter with casseroles when your pipes burst, or who sat with you when you couldn't sleep. Still, life in a town like Traverse City is threaded with secrets. Everyone has a drawer where they keep something they wouldn't show a stranger. Some people hide debts, some their mistakes, some the shape of things they overheard in passing. For me, my drawer was a box of letters from my father. He'd left when I was 9 and returned later with apologies that never quite filled in the past. I kept them under the floorboard beside my bed. That night, before things changed, I lifted the loose plank and read his handwriting again, thinking how small the house felt, how strange it was to need proof of who someone had been. It was nearly midnight when the main story began, and I had finished the second letter, the moon spilling across the floorboards like a slow, pale hand. I should have stopped there, should have gone to bed, should have tightened the deadbolt twice. Instead, I heard the low hum of something down by the river, not the steady, familiar sound of a boat engine, but a kind of stuttering that made the hairs on my arms rise. I told myself it was nothing. But the town has a way of making you accountable for what you notice. I pulled my coat on and went to the window. By the time I stepped outside, the October wind had sharpened. The streetlights on Twin Pines threw long, liquid shadows. There at the bend where the road met the path to the marina, a figure stood under the lamplight. Not walking, not moving. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a coat on a post. The figure was too still. Something in my chest went tight. I thought of Marla's laugh and the letters under the floorboard and the way Sheriff Danvers would always say, "If anything looks wrong, call." I started down the steps toward the river. The night seemed to lean in, listening. The first real footsteps of the story I could not have imagined came from a place I trusted, and that is where they hurt the most. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I moved toward the lamplight because that's what you do when something in your town stops being ordinary. You go look. The figure stayed still, a silhouette the color of an old photograph, and for a moment I caught the shape of a hood and the glint of metal at a belt. My mouth was dry. I told myself to breathe like I taught myself to when I dove under a stubborn hull to fix a carburetor. Slow, methodical, don't let the panic turn your hands into strangers. "Hello?" I called, because saying the word out loud felt like calling a name into a dark room and waiting to see if anyone answered. The figure didn't move. The lamplight made it hard to tell whether the person was facing me or turned away. My shoes tapped the wooden boardwalk in a sound that was somehow too loud for midnight. Under the lamplight, the shadow seemed to breathe. A second figure emerged, this one from the docks nearer the marina. Sheriff Cole Danvers, his flashlight a steady white in the dark. He was followed by Eamon, sleeves rolled, worried lines around his mouth. When Cole's light swung across the first figure, the person stepped back, and for a second I thought maybe it was a coat on a post, the way light makes objects lie. But it wasn't. It was a child. He was small, soaked to the knees, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide and glassy. No parents, no jacket worth a damn in October, and he looked like he'd been sleeping in the reeds. At first, you think, lost kid, and then the town tells you things like, this isn't a kid who wandered off, and you feel the edges of your shoulders tighten. Kids in Traverse City don't usually walk alone near the river at midnight. Tourists get lost in the summer. In October, people kept close to their heaters. This child had something else in his hands, a muddy, folded bit of paper that he clutched like a relic. Cole moved first, slow and a little softer than his badge made him. He knelt and put the beam on the paper. It was a photograph, a house with a white porch and an apple tree sagging with fruit. The photograph was old, the edges water-warped. On the back, in handwriting that wobbled like it had written by someone hurried or afraid, were the words, "Don't leave it in the cellar." "Is that yours, son?" Cole asked the boy. The boy shook his head. He didn't say anything. He answered by pressing the photograph back into his fist, as if he feared it might fly away. We wrapped the boy in Eamon's spare sweatshirt and brought him back toward my place to warm up, because that's what a town does. It absorbs emergencies like soup absorbs salt. I made coffee while Cole asked questions in that patient, practiced way of his. Where had the boy come from? Did he know his parents? Had he been hurt? The boy murmured nothing but kept reaching to the floorboards of my kitchen as if he could feel the letters under them through the wood. When the boy fell asleep, exhausted and twitching, Cole peeled back the photograph and ran a thumb along the back. "This paper's been in water," he said. "Someone wanted it kept wet, or it spent time in the river." He looked at me the way someone looks at a lock with the wrong key and decides to keep testing anyway. "Gavin, did you know anyone who used to live in that house?" I knew the house in the photograph. I knew a lot of houses, but that one, a narrow, pale thing on Old Mission with a sagging porch, had been vacant for years. The house had belonged to a man named Amos Pritchard. His name came up in diner conversations like a cough that wouldn't quit. Amos had been a logger, they'd said, a hard man who liked his privacy. He died in '06, they said, and the property had passed to nothing, or to the county, or to the kind of bureaucracy that keeps things in limbo. Kids dared each other to knock on that porch at Halloween. Nobody went in. The cellar door sat half closed like a secret you could see but not open. Cole's face dulled. "Amos's cellar," he said quietly. "This photo looks like Amos's place." That was where the story bent toward the sharp things, the cellar. In Traverse City, cellars have a reputation. Old, cool, smelling of earth and the ghost of things people used to do in their basements. People store preserves there, boxes of letters, tools that outlived their owners. I should have thought of that. Instead, on some quiet autopilot, I found myself telling Cole and Eamon, "I'll go with you." We walked in the low-pressure silence the town makes at night, the kind that carries the footsteps of 3 men and the distant clack of a shutter on the opposite shore. The house was exactly as the photograph promised. A sagging porch, a porch swing rusting in the moonlight, and the cellar hatch half open like a mouth. When we lifted it, the smell came up first, wet, cold, and laced with something I couldn't name. It made my stomach do that thing where you feel like you can't catch up to your breath. Cole went down first, his flashlight a firm slice through the dark. The cellar was more than an empty room. It was a small cathedral of boxes and old furniture stacked in acts of reverence. There were jars, lids with a film of dust, a moth that hit Cole's light and fluttered off like a judgment. Then Eamon's light found it. A rectangle of disturbed earth in the corner, a place where boxes had been shifted and dirt had been lain bare. There were prints in the soft soil, boot tracks and something smaller like a child's sneakers. Next to the bare patch lay an object wrapped in oilcloth. We unrolled it like reluctant archaeologists. Inside was a rowboat key, corroded but recognizable, and a small tin with matches inside untouched. Under the key was another photograph, water darkened, of the Boardman River with a boat tied to the same dock where my shop sat. Someone had taken our boat key then, or at least a key that fit our boats. My heart did an animal flip. Theft was one thing. Theft that involved a child in a cellar and a photograph was another. We found more. On a wooden shelf under an old quilt, a scrap of paper with a symbol marked in soot, 3 vertical lines intersected by a circle. I had a moment where I thought of nothing except how some marks look like the start of a warning. I didn't know that mark, and when I asked Cole, he didn't either. "I've seen weird things in this county," he said, voice flat as pavement, "but never like this." The boy woke when the wind found the cellar's small window and made it sigh. He reached for Cole, not for food or warmth, but for the photograph in his pocket. The minute his fingers found it, he whispered one word: Amos. The name landed heavy. It felt like a door closing somewhere else. Eamon swore softly. He'd known Amos as a man who kept to himself, and later as a house that nobody wanted to inherit. Cole's jaw worked. He told us to let the boy talk only to him and the social worker who would be called in the morning. He told me in that same quiet way to think about boats and keys and whether I had noticed anything missing from the shop. When I walked back to my house at the first hint of dawn, my head felt hollowed. I lifted the plank beside the bed, the one that kept my father's letters, and my fingers found paper and nothing else. The letters were there, folded and safe, but the small brass clip I'd kept with them, a key fob Amos had once given me on a summer afternoon, a joke about the old mill, was gone. Some nights you can ignore a missing thing. You chalk it up to forgetfulness, bad luck, the way fingers will sometimes misplace the world. But when a child's name is linked to a cellar and a photograph and your missing key fob, forgetfulness becomes a map with a route you can follow if you want to. And I wanted to know where that route led. We were only at the edge of it. The river had more to say, and the town had more mouths to open. Whoever had been moving through the night wasn't done, and everyone I loved seemed to be a pawn on a table I hadn't noticed was set. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When morning bled through the curtains, I realized sleep had left me at the exact moment the world got loud enough to be interesting again. My hands still smelled of river mud from the cellar. My throat tasted like old coffee and colder things. I went to the shop because you go to the place that holds the most familiar tools when the rest of life seems like a foreign country. It steadied me. Engines have no opinions about morality. They only want fuel and a patient hand. The place was a little too quiet. The back door hung on its hinges like a tired eye. My workbench had been rifled through, drawers left open, screws and oilcloth strewn like someone had been searching for a single small, stubborn thing. I thought of the missing key fob, the one Amos had once jokingly handed me, the kind of trinket you keep because it means a summer and a swear. It wasn't on my bench. It wasn't under the rag by the vise. But under the work table, tucked behind a toolbox, was a smear of mud and a metal scrap with that same soot-marked symbol, 3 vertical lines pierced by a circle. Whoever'd been in my place wanted me to know they'd been there. I called Cole. He met me in under 20 minutes, hands shoved deep in his coat, face wearing the look of someone who'd slept badly and eaten cold cereal for breakfast. He took one look at the symbol and swore a soft profanity under his breath. "This mark is the thread through all of it," he said. "The thefts, the boy, the cellar. Someone's marking things, or someone wanted to warn you away." The warning we found pinned to my shop door that afternoon was more blunt than a mark. A scrap of paper, torn and damp, read, "Stop digging." There was no signature, just a smear of brown like a thumbprint. I folded it, the paper creased like a fault line, and kept it in my pocket because threats are better when you know their shape. Marla came by that afternoon with 2 sandwiches and a determination thicker than the river ice in January. She had a way of being both soft with coffee and sharp with logic. "You can't just stare at the town and hope it explains itself," she said, handing me a sandwich and then sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "You need to look where people don't want you to look." We checked the docks. The boat where the key could have fit was gone, its mooring rope slack and drifting like a loose limb. On the piling nearest my shop, someone had scraped the symbol deep enough that the wood bled. It was new. My stomach folded. Whoever had used our boats had come close enough to leave a signature, and whoever left it wanted the message seen. That night, we did what a town does when it feels watched. We went out together. Eamon came along, practical and stubborn, and Cole rode shotgun in an old cruiser whose heater coughed like it was smirking. We parked near Holloway Mill where the trees make a black wall and the road narrows, so 2 cars aren't supposed to pass at the same time. The mill had been a dare spot for kids since my dad's time. Windows boarded, its sign swinging on a solitary hinge. Lately, the mill had been a place the town suspected of hiding more than rust. A truck idled farther down the road when we arrived, lights off, engine ticking like a sleeping animal. Someone had been there first. We kept to the shadow of the pines and moved like hunters who weren't sure if what we sought was an animal or a person. By the time we reached the back of the mill, the truck had vanished, but not before it left impressions. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, and another smear of that soot mark symbol carved into the mill's rotting side. Someone was mapping this place in symbols like a cartographer of fear. We found a side door with its lock tampered. Inside the mill smelled of old grain and the particular coldness of abandoned places. There were footprints in the dust, both adult and child-sized, and an overturned crate with a child's shoe beneath it. It matched the prints in Amos's cellar, small sneaker treads and a set of boot prints that had come and gone like a rumor. On the mill's floor, we found paper, handwritten notes, names crossed out, a string of dates. At the bottom of one page, scrawled, hurried, and in a hand that trembled, was the line, "Don't leave them in the cellar." My hands were shaking when I picked up the sheet. A cold, absurd thought ran through me. What had started as petty theft was curving into something else, into a ledger of human things. I wanted to choke the air out of the room, to make it confess, but the mill only sighed. Someone was standing in the dark when Marla's voice cut the silence. "Gavin." It wasn't Marla. A man stepped from behind a stack of beams, tall and loose-limbed, face half hidden by a cap. He had that way about him of a person comfortable in the night. For a second, my brain tried to name him and failed. The man didn't make a run for it. He didn't need to. His presence alone was the threat. "You shouldn't be poking around," he said. His voice was low, the kind of calm that comes from someone used to getting what they want by patience rather than force. "Who are you?" I asked, because asking a question still makes you feel like you have control. He only smiled, a thin thing that didn't reach his eyes. A lot of people have been taking what isn't theirs. A lot of people have been making mistakes. Some things are safer where they are. "Like what?" Eamon asked, stepping forward despite himself. The man's smile went colder. He spat on the dusty floor. "You won't like the answer." He turned to go, and then, because he liked the sensation of being feared, he added, "Leave the boy alone. Leave Amos in peace." He moved away like the night itself had put him back together. We chased. I shouldn't have, but I did. We split. Cole and Eamon took one path, Marla and I another, and my lungs burned for the first time in months, as if I'd been running from something I knew too well. The man was faster than he looked. He was waiting by the river's edge as if he'd been there all along. When I closed to tackle him, he slipped, and in the scuffle, I found the boat key clipped to his belt. It was mine. He laughed then, a short, bitter sound, and slipped into the dark, and the water swallowed him. I stood there dripping, the river murmuring like gossip, and felt how small I was in the face of whatever had been moving through my town. Cole found me a moment later, hand on my shoulder, breathing hard, eyes grave. "He's not alone," he said, "and he's not just a thief." When we returned to the shop, the house next to mine, an old place with peeling paint, had its porch light on. A neighbor, Mrs. Klein, waved us over. She lived alone and kept a garden in the summer and a stove always warm for pie. She told us that Amos had kept a journal in the years before he died, something he'd shown her in a moment of trust. He said if anything happened to him, "Don't go into the cellar," she said, fingers twisting a towel like a rosary. He told me to give the book to someone who would read it right. She handed me a milk crate. Inside, wrapped in a moth-eaten sweater, was Amos's journal. Its cover smelled like basement air and lemon oil. I opened it with hands that didn't feel like my own. The handwriting inside was cramped and sooner than you'd expect, urgent. It detailed names, dates, and then toward the back a crude map with marks, the boardman, the mill, and a circle with 3 lines through it. A notation below the map read, "If found, warn. If taken, bury under the apple tree. Do not leave in the cellar." The pages blurred with the sense that things were being put in order against our will. Someone had been keeping a ledger, someone who tried to protect what they could and left directions like a beacon for those who might come after. Someone else had been reading the ledger and had decided to open it anyway. We didn't sleep that night. We planned. At dawn, we would follow the map Amos left and see how deep the rabbit hole went. I kept the journal by my pillow like a talisman, and when I drifted to a restless doze, I dreamed of the river dragging at my feet and a child's hand grabbing mine and pulling me under. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We followed Amos's crude map at dawn, 3 of us in a car that smelled like coffee and resolve. The map led us down Old Mission Road, past the apple orchards whose limbs bowed under October's last fruit, and then down a narrow lane where a line of stones marked the edge of a property no one had taken an interest in for years. Mrs. Klein's crate had a penciled note tucked inside. "If you ever need me, check the apple tree." She had not been joking. The apple tree was older than most things in town, trunk cracked like an old fist, roots that had gripped the earth when the mill still ran. Amos's note said to dig under it if anything was taken. So we dug. We dug with the absurd hope of a man trying to find a lost thing and the resigned determination of a town that had learned how to unearth the stories it tried to forget. It took hours. Our hands went raw, our nails clogged with earth, and the sky slid from a fearful pale to a bruised gray. The shovel struck wood first, a box, nailed tight, the scent of damp cloth and time seeping through the seams. Inside were small things that made the air feel wrong. Children's toys with salt stains, a stack of photographs like the one the boy had clutched, and dozens of little hand-drawn maps. Each map marked homes, cellars, and a single recurring symbol. 3 lines crossed by a circle. We weren't the only ones digging through history. Sheriff Danvers radioed in that they'd found a cellar reachable from the riverbank near the old boathouse, one of the places Amos had marked. We opened it together and found a low, cramped space where someone had been living intermittently, as both a closet and a coffin. There were blankets, canned goods, and a series of shoeboxes labeled with dates. In those shoeboxes were things that made the whole thing frank. Small shoes, a child's hat, a name written in a careful hand. The names matched names taken from local missing persons reports the county had long since set aside under unresolved. It became clear, fast and terrible, what Amos had been trying to guard against. He'd stumbled onto a group, call them what you want, a ring, a cabal, a sect, who believed they were saving certain children from lives they considered broken. Their logic was warped. Remove the children from what they called corrupting influences and keep them hidden in cellars and back rooms until the world proved itself safe again. They moved like a shadow through the edges of tourism and poverty, recruiting the lonely, the disenfranchised, people who believed in second chances turned poisonous. The man from the mill was part of that shadow, but not the whole thing. We found evidence of others: notes, rope, a ledger with names, and a crude list of addresses. The ledger had one phrase repeated in different hands: return them to the earth. It was written like a commandment. We set traps and watched. Cole coordinated with neighboring counties, and Marla and Eamon visited every house on Amos's map. A few of the members were arrested when they returned to check a stash. Others fled into the scrub in the dawn. The one at the river who'd had the key in his belt? He was the courier, a man who moved goods and people between cellars. He'd been paid in a mix of money, promises, and a belief that his hands were cleaning the world. He went quiet when we brought him in. In Amos's journal, we found confessions. No, not confessions, but notes of suspicion and fear. He had tried to intervene quietly at first. He had hidden photographs and maps to keep them from being taken, burying them under the apple tree with directions to warn and bury, because he knew that if the wrong people found those pages, they'd use them to expand their reach. He'd been looking over his shoulder for years and had left instructions for anyone who cared enough to follow them. Amos had not been saint or savior. He was a neighbor who'd grown tired of not acting. The children were the hardest to find because the group was good at rerouting suspicion and using empty buildings like an invisible network, but they were not infallible. A pattern emerged: cellars with fresh footprints, tin cans emptied and replaced, blankets folded just so. We found 3 children that week in corners of the town we walked past every day: a basement behind a shuttered bakery, a root cellar in a farm no one drove past in winter, and a cramped crawl space under a boathouse. Their faces were thin with hunger and light-starved, their hands small and trusting. When one of them saw the sheriff's badge, the child let out a laugh that sounded like a bell. It was grief and relief braided together. There were arrests, yes, but not the tidy kind you see in a movie. People we brought in insisted they had only ever wanted safety. Some broke down and cried when they saw the children's faces. Others stonewalled, and a few slipped away before the law could wrap its hands around them. Cole's team found documentation linking parts of the operation to an older man in town who had since died. Someone who used the language of renewal and left the symbol on wooden paper like a signature. We never fully untangled who paid whom, who convinced whom, or how long it had been happening. Some threads ran back years. Others led to the open road. After the arrests and the rescues, the town collected itself the way a body collects itself after a scare. You patch what you can, keep moving, share casseroles. There were town meetings, and the sheriff put out a hotline. Parents hugged their kids a little longer at night. Amos's journal went into evidence, and the photographs and notes under the apple tree were cataloged. The boy who first appeared at the lamplight, he was reunited with an aunt in Ohio who had been looking for him for years. He kept the photograph in a new pocket, and when he smiled, the town felt pried open and oddly safer. For me, the scar was smaller but sharp. I found my key fob folded into one of Amos's maps, hidden, it turned out, so I would find it if I cared enough to follow a man's messy instructions. The fob wasn't the point, it was the marker that made me responsible. In the end, responsibility felt heavier than any fear. I had expected the town would return to the way it had been, a place of orchards and weekend tourists and polite waves. It didn't. It became more human and less naive. People began to check on one another in ways they hadn't before. Calls in the rain, extra plates in the oven. Amos's house was cleaned out and made into something useful, a community room where the sheriff's office held child safety workshops and where local volunteers kept a small fund for late-night needs. The apple tree still stood, its roots deeper now for what it had held. I kept one photograph from the box, a small, soggy thing of a summer day by the boardman, a child's hand reaching for an oar. I put it in the same floorboard with my father's letters. Some things you keep as warnings, some you keep to remind you what you were trying to save. The last time I walked the boardman, the river didn't feel like a thing to fear, but like a place that remembered. The town had been hollowed and stitched back together, and in those stitches there was a new kind of watchfulness. It made me think of Amos, how a man could change the shape of a town by caring enough to hide and then to leave instructions for those who would follow. We will never know every truth, and a few people slipped away into the dark, but more names came back into the light than went out. If you ever find a mark of 3 lines crossed by a circle, don't chalk it up to graffiti. Ask questions. Check cellars. Look under apple trees. The world sometimes hides its wrongs in the places we assume are safest, and it takes stubborn people and messy, brave acts to pull them out. This is the night I keep with me. The river has a quieter voice now, and when it calls, I listen. Some things are fixed. Some things are only quieter. We learn to be a town that doesn't pretend it doesn't remember. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jacob Whitman. I was 32 the night it happened, June 14th, 2019. If I sound calm now, it's because I've told this 100 different ways to keep it tethered to language instead of memory. But the first telling always felt like trying to hold water in a cupped hand. It slips, and what you thought you remembered rearranges into something that looks like a lie. So I tell the small truths first. I grew up in a quiet town outside Traverse City, Michigan. I moved back there after my divorce to buy the house my grandmother left me, a narrow 2-story on a street of maples, 3 houses from the bay. I worked nights fixing boats at the marina and days teaching a GED class at the community center. My friends were the kind who checked in with a cup of coffee or a 6-pack. Dependable, ordinary people with ordinary worries. My closest friend, Joel Kessler, ran the bait shop and had an old dog named Rust. Claire Benton taught yoga and brought over lemon bars when my plumbing backed up. Those are the kinds of names you need to know, because part of why this haunted me was how ordinary everything was. Traverse City was, in late spring, almost painfully pretty. The harbor glittered with the last slow breaths of boat traffic, and the cherry orchards were a patchwork of green and white as the buds filled. People came up for the weekend, for the festivals, for the lakes. We counted on the seasons here like clock hands. You walked to get groceries, and you knew your neighbor by the sound of their steps on the porch. My grandmother's house had a small attic window that faced the bay. At night, I would sit there with a mug of black coffee and read until the house creaked itself to sleep. The town felt safe. I say that not to romanticize it, but because the contrast matters. The terror that finds you always looks quieter against the backdrop of the life you used to know. It makes you ask how something that feels obvious, the town, the people, the routines, could fail to save you. Before the night changed everything, there were other small threads in my life. I was still carrying the bruises of a marriage that had ended 2 years earlier because we wanted different things. I was trying, clumsily, to be a better brother to my younger sister, Mara, who lived in Grand Rapids. I was learning to laugh again, to sit with Joel over cheap beer and complain about winter. I had this habit of going out at odd hours to walk the shoreline when I couldn't sleep. The water draws you. I used to think I went because it calmed me. Later, I'd think I went because grief is easier to walk beside than to look at. 2 weeks before June 14th, I started seeing something odd in my neighborhood. A white pickup truck idling at the corner near dusk, always the same truck, with a faded license plate I couldn't quite make out. At first, I chalked it up to a contractor or someone dropping off materials. Joel said maybe a tourist. You get strange cars in a town like this. Golf carts with flower decals, trucks with kayaks bolted to their roofs. But the truck kept showing up. One night it sat across the street from my house for nearly 4 hours, engine off, headlights dimmed. I watched from the blinds and finally, around midnight, saw a man in a dark jacket step out, walk to the mailbox, and then slip back into the truck and drive away. I told myself it was nothing. I told Claire, who shrugged and said, "People pace, people watch. It's the festival schedule." She lived her life in the present tense. It helped her sleep. The old house itself had its quirks. The attic door stuck. The third stair from the top had a soft give, like a sigh. The yard had a hawthorn tree my grandmother planted, and a small shed that smelled of oil and varnish. I had left the shed locked because it kept the neighborhood kids out of the gardening tools. But there were other things I knew. The way moonlight hit the bay in June, the particular smell of salt and cut grass, the sound of wind and then the maples that made the whole house feel like it was breathing. All small, ordinary facts. I cataloged them like talismans, hoping they'd keep me safe. Work at the marina was steady that summer. A regular, middle-aged couple, the Rivers, hired me to repair a pot on their 21-foot cruiser. Joel and I worked late, elbows bruised, hands smelling of diesel. At night, after work, I'd walk down to the water and talk to Rust when Joel couldn't take his dog along. Rust had a limp and a bark like a rusty hinge. People think you tell ghost stories only when you're alone, but there were times I shared small, nervous details with Joel. "White truck," I'd say. "Saw it again on Lakeshore." He'd chew on an unlit cigarette and grin. "Maybe it's the ice cream man," he'd say, and I'd laugh, but the laugh was thin. The town had its own history, too. Old legends and local nervousness. My grandmother used to tell me about a stretch of shoreline north of the lighthouse where the fog sat heavy in summers, and people said you could hear the lake talking if you listened. Kids dared each other to walk it at midnight. There was a house that everyone swore the previous owner had simply disappeared from. Shutters flapping and coffee on the table, no footprints in the snow. Superstition in Traverse City wasn't a thing people admitted to in cafes, but it threaded through conversations with a laugh or a glance. The way people spend money on umbrella repair without saying why. So by June 14th, I had a life that was equal parts normal and aching. I had the white truck seen twice, the old house creaks, a handful of friends who cared without asking too much, and the shoreline that called to me like an old song when the night was too loud. The setting was mundane. A Midwestern street of maples, porch lights turned off like teeth, a dock, a bay. The only oddness that had any shape was that truck. I had been up late that Friday, fixing a window the Rivers had shattered with a careless line during a storm. The sky that night had been a bowl of bruised blue, a storm giving the air a hold like a warning. I didn't sleep. At 2:17 a.m., I left the house with nothing but a flashlight in my pocket and the key to the shed. I told myself I was going to walk down to the bay, sit on the rocks, and count the seconds between the waves. I told myself I would be back before dawn. I stepped into the dark. The main story begins when the truck reappears at the corner, when the soft give in the third stair seems to tighten into a hinge, when footsteps that are not mine fall in rhythm with mine on the boardwalk. It begins when the fog folds over the bay like a mouth closing, and some small part of me remembers a story my grandmother told, that the lake remembers. But that is where the night opens and the rest of the truth starts to unfold, and I can still feel the shape of it when I breathe. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fog came in a thin, hungry sheet, the kind that swallows the world and makes the street lamps into halos. I could hear my own breath, a small animal sound. The boardwalk to the bay was slick with spray. I walked faster because walking slower felt like asking the dark to notice me. The truck sat where I'd seen it before, backlit by the weak glow of a business sign across the way. Up close, it wasn't as anonymous as I had believed. The paint had a dull, pitted look like old fish scales, and there was a small dent on the left rear fender. The license plate I could see now looked half melted by salt and sun. The last two digits, an 11 and a 7, were clear enough. I noted them with that odd practical part of my brain that inventories things for later. Make, dent, numbers. It was a stupid comfort, like naming a shadow so it would stay a shadow. As I passed, someone called my name. The voice was low, close, not far behind the truck. Jacob. I froze. The walkway was narrow. The fog made it feel like we were the last things on Earth. I turned. A man stood by the truck, hands in pockets. He was taller than me, broad-shouldered, with a baseball cap pulled low. Because my brain wanted to make sense of everything in the tiny ways it could, I cataloged his features. A scar near his left cheekbone, a crooked tooth when he smiled. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Lost? He said. His voice had a neutral, practiced cadence, like someone who'd said the same line a dozen times. No, I said. My voice sounded like a stranger's. Just walking. Bad night for walks, he said. He didn't step back. He tilted his head as if listening to something behind me. The truck's engine was off. For a moment we stood like that, two things in the fog. Something in me told me to go home. My feet wanted to turn, but the drink of the shoreline, habit maybe, kept me there. You the one who's been sitting at the corner? I asked. He chuckled. Maybe. There was a softness to that word, like a trap snapping shut. He moved closer. Up close, the smell of him hit me. Cigarettes, oil, something metallic I couldn't name. I backed up. He didn't move faster. He matched me like a shadow. You shouldn't be alone, Jacob, he said. How do you know my name? I asked. The question sounded stupid even to me. Of course he knew my name. Everyone in town knows most of the other names. He took 2 more steps and reached for me. I had nowhere to go. The boardwalk dropped away to a concrete seawall on my left and someone else's yard on my right. The man grabbed my wrist. His grip was not rough at first. It was firm, businesslike. He smelled like stale breath in the inside of a storage locker. Let go, I said. Not so fast, he said. You looked good in the light. It was like a switch flipped inside me, the part that remembers survival more than fear. I twisted free the way I'd done with a stubborn line on a boat, and it bought me a split second. He cursed, short and ugly. Then he lunged. I fell, the flashlight skittering away and clattering into the water with a sound like a small animal dying. He had a hand on my collar, pulling me toward the truck. I fought back the way men do when they know they have to. Raw, animal, inefficient, angry. I kicked at his shins, hit his ribs. He smelled of cigarette ash and wet wool. For a few surreal seconds, it was only me and him and the slap of our bodies against the boardwalk and the bay breathing under us. I heard the thump of my heart in my ears like a drum. The man, there were other details now. A thin, black tattoo at the base of his thumb, a deep-set laugh line, managed to wrench my arms behind my back. He moved to the passenger side and yanked the door open. Quiet, he said. His voice was not cruel, it was flat. A hand landed over my mouth. I tasted salt and something sweet. I felt a second hand push me forward, and then the world tipped. The truck smelled of damp carpet and a faint chemical cleaner. Someone slammed the door. The engine turned over and the truck rolled forward as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The cab was small. In the dim light, I could make out the man's profile, and in the driver's seat, another figure, someone who had been watching like an animal watches before it strikes. The driver's hands were steady on the wheel. They didn't talk. The road that led away from the bay unspooled into the fog. We drove. I don't remember all the way. Memory from that night feels like raindrops on glass, small, fractured pieces. At one point, the truck stopped at a gas station on the highway, and the man shoved a paper cup into my hands. I remember drinking as if I were made of thirsty things. The coffee tasted like despair. The driver never left the truck. They stood outside in the fog like two shadows rearranging the world. When they spoke, it was to ask me questions I couldn't answer and things they wouldn't care to hear. Why do you walk alone? Who do you sleep with when you're not at the house? Do you go out when people are awake? They wanted to make me confess to ordinary, tiny acts as if they were wrong. I lied because lying is a way to keep yourself together. I said I had plans in the morning. I said a friend would be by. I said things that were partly true. The questions were designed to map me, my habits, my friends, my routines. Whoever these people were, they wanted the scaffolding of my life. We stopped again at an abandoned marina north of town. It smelled like rot and old rope. The truck's engine cut, and the silence pressed in. They led me down between rotting pilings to a small boathouse scaled by lichen. Inside, light pooled weakly from somewhere higher up. The man who had taken me, he introduced himself with a name that was wrong, and I didn't correct him, set me down in a folding chair. The other stayed by the door, silent as a sentinel. They left and came back with a rag and a small first aid kit. Someone bandaged a cut on my palm without asking if I needed it. They had a carefulness that felt like an insult. They brushed hair from my forehead and spoke to me like I was a child who had wandered too far. "You're lucky you weren't wearing a watch," the man said at one point, a sentence that made no sense then, but later would hum with meaning. They weren't violent in the way you'd imagine. No loud threats, no slashes. But they were precise, like surgeons of fear. They wanted compliance, not catharsis. They told me not to go to the police. They told me if I told anyone, things would happen that would make my days unrecognizable. They spoke of small, specific consequences. Someone moving into my shed, a note under my door, but the threat was in the way their voices stayed soft. After a while, you believe that the smallest things can be the worst. When they released me, they left a scrap of paper on my chest with a number scrawled on it and a short line I remember like a bruise. "We remember." The air tasted metallic. The walk home seemed longer than any I had made in my life. The house was lit, windows thrown wide as if nothing had happened at all. Joel's dog sat on the porch like an accusation. I didn't go to the police that night. I cleaned the small cuts with rubbing alcohol until my hands ached. I found the dent on my wrist where a cuff had pressed. I ripped the scrap of paper into tiny pieces and flushed most of it down the sink because there is a part of you that thinks destruction of evidence is some kind of protection. The next morning, when the world had purged itself with sunlight and the bay glittered the way it always had, Joel came by with coffee and a look I know too well. A man who knew he had been cheated out of a friend and didn't know how to fix it. "You look like hell," he said. I wanted to tell him everything exactly and perfectly to make sense of the wrongness. Instead, I said, "I fell. I slipped." He didn't buy it. "You scared me last night," he said. "Your lights were out all night. We went down by the marina." I told him about the truck, about the men. He listened, and the gravity of it settled differently between us. He ran a hand through his hair. "You gotta tell someone," he said. I wanted to, but I also remembered the man's voice, the way he had used smallness as leverage. I remembered the feeling of being cataloged. I remembered the scrap of paper and the way the words "we remember" had sat against my ribs. The police felt like a promise and a risk. The town felt like a net and also a labyrinth. It was the small things that announced how wrong my life had become. A voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't know that was nothing but a breathy silence. A tire flattened outside my shed. A child's drawing pushed under my door with a crude picture of the house and a single angry scribble where my attic window should be. Each one rearranged the room I lived in until I hardly recognized the furniture. They were patient. They left markers. They wanted me aware. And when I realized that they had been watching not for a night, but for weeks, cataloging my movements and habits because someone had to notice the dent in the truck, I understood that the terror I felt had a slow, cold intention behind it. The lake that had always seemed to cradle me now felt like a thing that could tilt. I told myself I would go to the police the next day. I didn't. Instead, I sat with Joel, and we made plans that were half defensive and half foolish. We shored up locks, we bought motion sensor lights, we learned the license plate combinations for trucks in the county like a prayer. I learned how to watch without showing my hands. At night, I dreamed of the boathouse and woke with my hands clenched as if they still held an oar. I would sit in the attic window and listen to the bay, waiting for the sound of tires on wet pavement to tell me whether the world would break again. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They told me later that what broke the case wasn't bravado or luck, but the little stupid things that people keep track of. Security footage from the gas station, a license plate fragment I had copied into my head at 2 a.m, and the nervousness of a man who had never been good at lying. After the boatyard night, the incidents escalated with the precise cruelty of someone testing limits. A window at the community center shattered with a rock meant to wake me. A coil of rope was left on my porch like a question. Claire's lemon bars arrived one afternoon with a thumbprint stamped into the plastic. I kept thinking, why me? Why my grandmother's house? Why the attic window that faced the bay? Joel finally talked me into going to the sheriff. He shoved a mug of coffee into my hand like a weapon and said, plain and loud, "You're not a lone thing to be eaten." The deputy who took our report had soft eyes and a slow, exact manner. He asked for details and wrote them down, not dismissive but careful. When I told him about the truck, the dent, the fish scale paint, the last 2 digits of the plate, he raised an eyebrow and promised to check the highway cameras. It was small things that turned into a net. The gas station footage from the highway exit, grainy, black and white, too close to sunrise to be pretty, showed a white pickup pulling in. I watched it with the deputy until the light went through the screen and the driver turned his head. There was the scar on his cheek and the crooked tooth in a blink of pixels. The county plate lookup with partial digits returned 3 hits. 1 matched the make and an old registration address in a storage yard north of town. They found the storage yard on a Tuesday when the wind fell and the maples stopped whispering like they were trying not to be heard. We drove up with Deputies Klein and Marino, Joel riding shotgun like he was about to gut a fish. The yard was a grid of corrugated metal and tarps, the air heavy with oil and the smell of old varnish. There were pickup trucks crammed between pallets and a man with a baseball cap who moved like someone expecting trouble. They didn't need to announce themselves. The man at the cap dropped a cigarette and turned slowly. The scar was there, the crooked smile, the thumb tattoo. When the deputy called his name, Eli Sutter, his face flushed something that looked like recognition and something like resignation. He had a short, sharp answer to the questions. The kind people learn in thinking they'll never be caught. I was there, yeah, I had no idea. A search turned up a satchel in the bed of his truck with a roll of map pins, a camera, a rag with strands of my sweater, and a stack of crudely drawn maps of the shoreline with my house circled in red. It felt unreal, like the world had slid from a picture book into something darker. They arrested Eli on trespassing and possession of burglary tools. He argued and then got quiet. In the corner of the lot, the other pickup, the one I'd seen idling near my street, was there too, its license plate half pulled off and a dent where I had noticed it. There had been a passenger that night. The name they traced to that truck was Garrett Hale, a drifter with a history of petty crimes who vanished the week before we found Eli. Garrett's name came up like a ghost in records. People remembered him, but no one could say where he'd gone. At Eli's arraignment, he didn't look like a monster. He looked small and exhausted, the kind of person who has practiced being half invisible until they forget what it's like to be seen. The sheriff showed the photos of the truck and the nails of evidence. There was the camera footage from the gas station. There was a witness, one of the dock hands, who said he'd seen 2 men at the marina at odd hours. The prosecution painted a tidy picture, a man who had followed and cataloged and finally tried to snap a life into silence. The defense was a tangle of explanations. Garrett never appeared in court. He'd slipped the map of the shoreline into the places that are thin between towns, old logging roads, abandoned cabins, migrant camps. I imagined him breathing in other people's dark places, untroubled by names. They tried to tie Garrett to Eli as an accomplice. But without Garrett, the worst of it felt like a room with a missing door. The trial was a slow, monstrous thing. I had to sit in a courtroom and explain how my chest had been pressed against a folding chair in a boathouse and how metal tasted like my name. I had to say out loud what the men had whispered in the dark. We remember. Saying it made it less magic and more a threat that could be policed. When the jury convicted Eli of stalking and multiple counts of trespass, the room breathed like it had been holding its breath for months. He received a sentence that put him away for a few years. It calmed the town the way a bandage calms a wound, practical, temporary, necessary. We never found Garrett. There were rumors that he had been picked up for a different crime in another county, that he'd left the state, that he'd drowned somewhere down towards the river where people think the currents keep secrets. I didn't know what to do with not knowing. It felt like a loose end tied to the back of my neck. After the court, I couldn't sleep in the house that had so many small memories pressed into its walls. Joel helped me pack and offered me a room above his bait shop until I felt like I could look at the attic window without my chest tightening. The sheriff put motion cameras on the property and checked in with us like a man who knew the texture of long worry. Claire made me lemon bars and insisted I come to yoga, which I did once and then never again. The town watched, politely. Traverse City had a way of returning to its festivals and paychecks and the pastel enthusiasm of tourists, because that is what towns do. They reset the ordinary. People asked if I felt safe after Eli's sentence. I wanted to say yes, because it sounded like hope, but the truth was more complicated. The fear never vanished. It lightened. Sometimes weeks would go by with no trucks idling at corners, and the bay would look like ordinary water, and I'd almost believe in safety. Then I'd see a pickup that could have been any truck, and my hand would go to my pocket to check for a flashlight the way a reflex checks for a pulse. The memory lives in a muscle now. There were nights, especially in the first year, when I'd sit at the attic window and listen for tires on wet pavement. I'd run the timeline in my head, the truck at twilight, the man at the mailbox, the boathouse, the paper that said, "We remember." I asked myself if the remembering was personal or a statement about a place that keeps more than it should. My grandmother used to say the lake remembers the people who live beside it, storing small acts like stones. I used to think that was a poetic way to teach reverence. After that summer, it sounded less like a metaphor and more like a warning. Life moved forward because that's what it does. I sold the house a year later to a family who painted the shutters gray and planted perennials along the porch. I bought a smaller place inland where the road didn't hum with tourists and the maples weren't my neighbors. Joel kept the bait shop and got a new dog after Rust passed, small things that stitch a life back together. The sheriff retired not long after, his shoulders easing like someone who'd been carrying a weight. Eli wrote letters from jail, short, blank ones that tried to be apologies. I kept one in a drawer like a fossil and never opened it. If there's a finality to tell you, it's less about justice than about an uneasy truce. The men that terrorized me were not a supernatural thing. They were human, messy, and cowardly, and capable of cruelty. That makes them worse sometimes because you could have met them at a hardware store once. It also means they could be stopped by evidence, by community, by the dull work of detectives and neighbors who refuse to pretend they don't see. There are nights when the memory of the boathouse wakes me and the fear flexes like a remembered limb. But there are also evenings when the bay looks like glass and the town's maples clatter gently in a wind that sounds like forgiveness. I try to live in those evenings now, to let their quiet balance the sharpness of what happened. I tell this story because the telling takes the pressure off the memory and hands it to words, which can be rearranged and shared and sometimes softened. This is my truth. A white truck, A boathouse, a handful of men who thought they could own a quiet life by breaking it. They didn't get to take that entirely. I still walk the shoreline sometimes because sea air is a stubborn healer. You can live through being remembered by bad things. You can also be remembered for how you stood after them. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 32 years old. The incident I'm about to tell you happened on October 13th, 2018. People who know Traverse City think of cherry orchards and tourist streets, the slow curl of West Bay around the shoreline, and the lighthouse folks pose by in summer. But every town has shadows, and Traverse City is no exception. I had moved back after a few years away, a job in Lansing, a short relationship that didn't last, and I wanted something quieter. I rented a small house on Old Hammond Road near an area locals called Silver Pine because of the stand of pines that creaked in wind. My circle wasn't large. Mason Holt, my coworker and longtime friend, could spin a joke out of thin air. Abby Lane owned the coffee shop downtown. She knew everyone's name and brewed a mean, dark roast. I met a few of the older folks too. Mr. Sanford at the hardware store and Sheriff Tom Whitaker, who would wave when he drove past. The only stranger I kept seeing was a thin man who walked the shoreline at dusk. He never spoke, but he'd watched the water for a long time. For months before the incident, the town felt like a storybook. I was restoring a shed behind my house into a small workshop and spent evenings with classical music playing low and a beer, sanding and staining. On weekends, I hiked the trails, sometimes with Mason, sometimes alone. I started to notice little things: footsteps on the gravel path outside my bedroom window late at night, a cigarette butt on my porch, though I didn't smoke, a small, folded scrap of paper on my kitchen table. I kept a journal more out of habit than anything. It turned out to be useful because the gap between a strange feeling and a real threat is where clarity hides. I wrote down faces I didn't know, license plates I didn't recognize, the stray things that didn't belong. Mason teased me about it, but he also brought extra locks and helped me install motion sensor lights along the back path. Abby, when I mentioned the cigarette butt, offered to watch the shop later into the evening, so someone was around. Traverse City has a quiet history. People don't talk about at noon. Alongside the sawmills and the resort era are older stories. A caretaker's cabin on the eastern rim of the bay where a man once kept watch and then vanished, and a newspaper clipping about a boathouse fire in the 1940s that left questions more than answers. The weeks leading up to October 13th tightened. Little things accumulated. A calendar stolen from my porch with my initials on the back, birdseed poured out across the walkway in a rough circle, and once, late at night, a flashlight beam that moved behind the pines as if someone walked the property edge. One night I found my shed unlocked and the tools rearranged, not stolen but moved, as if someone was trying to make a point. The sheriff came by after I called. He took notes and told me to stay vigilant. I began to notice patterns. The notes always mentioned water. Elias's boat seemed to be around more than before. People shrugged and said the lake has moods. Mason suggested I stay at his place. Abby offered me coffee and company. The nights I stayed away, I slept better, but the draw of my own house pulled me back until I couldn't avoid it. Then there were the dreams. Vivid, stupidly detailed dreams where I stood on the pier at West Bay and the water was black and still, and something beneath the surface moved with deliberate, patient grace. I woke gasping, as if I'd been underwater and forgotten how to breathe. For the first time, I realized fear had teeth. I started carrying a small flashlight and a pocket knife whenever I walked home after dark. It felt ridiculous and, at the same time, oddly necessary. When October 13th arrived, the sky was low. I had been working late in the shed, and around 11, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Meet me at the pier. Midnight. Alone. I told Mason and Abby I was stepping out and took my flashlight. The pier at midnight felt wrong. The water was a flat black. At the end of the dock, a figure leaned against the railing, tall, thin, hood up. He didn't leave when I called. Close up, his hands were stained with a dark, oily substance that gleamed in my beam. He smiled as if he'd planned this. We spoke briefly. He said the lake remembers. He stepped closer, and then everything snapped. There was a shove, the world tipped, and cold water slammed into me. I was dragged under, lungs burning. When I surfaced, I clawed for the pier and felt a boot shove me, hard enough to jar my ribs. Panic stripped reason away. I kicked, grabbed a ladder rung, and hauled myself up. When I crawled onto the shore, the man was gone. No footprints led away, only a smear on the dock and a scrap of paper tucked into a gap in the planks that read, "Remember water." In the morning, the sheriff checked the shoreline. He found the ladder bent and the dock scored, but no sign of the attacker. That night changed something in me. I still hear water and see oily gleams when the light hits the pier. I keep the journal and scraps sealed in an envelope. I never learned who the thin man was, and sometimes when the wind comes off the bay, I feel as if the lake itself remembers me. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After that night on the pier, I tried to go back to the ordinary rhythms of life, but ordinary had been rearranged. The days became a ledger of small, suspicious entries. A neighbor asking if I'd been on the lake, Abby bringing over soup and an extra mug as if to anchor me. Mason staying up too late to talk about anything but the football game. Sheriff Tom stopped by more than once. He was careful and quiet, a man who carried the weight of a county in his posture, and he said the right things without promising miracles. The sheriff had a theory about pranksters at first, the kind of local mischief that sometimes wanders into meanness. He ran the usual checks: fingerprints on the dock, a canvass of neighbors, a call to the county for any similar reports. Nothing concrete turned up. The dock had scuff marks, but those could have been anything. The scrap of paper with "Remember Water" was put into evidence, and, oddly, I felt better and worse for letting it go. Better because it was out of my hands, worse because it made the threat real enough to be cataloged. Mason and I built a small security setup, a couple of battery cameras with motion triggers. They were cheap, the kind you buy at the hardware store and feel a little foolish for. Still, on the third night after the pier, they caught something. We watched the footage together in the glow of his living room, the video grainy and quiet. At first, there was nothing but rain and the way the porch lights smeared across the gravel. Then, at 2:13 a.m., a figure passed through the frame, thin, wearing a dark coat, hood up. He moved like someone moving through memory, slow and deliberate. Mason paused the frame and zoomed in. The face stayed in shadow, but there was something odd. Not a scuff of mud, but a dark, oily sheen on the hands. We took a still to Abby. She frowned, leaning over the laptop as though proximity might solve the blur. "That hand," she said, pointing at the paused frame, "like something from the boathouse photo my grandma had." Her grandmother had once run a small boat rental in the 1950s. Abby kept a stack of yellowed photos in the back of the shop. That week, she brought one in. Grainy and curled, men in suspenders around a dock, an old motorboat in the background. Tucked into the corner of the photograph, someone had written name: Jonas Kells. Jonas Kells. The name felt like a key you turn in an old lock. In the public library, the microfilm machine coughed through years of the local paper. Abby and I sat in the hush of stacks while her fingers worked the machine, and my heart did the same. The clipping that came up was small, the headline blocked by a fold, but the words beneath were unmistakable. Boathouse fire leaves questions. 1947. The article told of a fire that consumed a caretaker's boathouse on the northern rim, a child who had vanished from a picnic that day, and a caretaker named Jonas Kells who disappeared within weeks. There was talk of insurance, a man who drank too much, half the town that whispered it was an accident, and the other half that said someone had walked into the water of their own choosing. For a long time, the old stories and new evidence tangled into a single rope I couldn't unpick. Why had someone left a scrap that said only "Remember Water"? Why did the figure in the camera look like he stepped out of one of Abby's sepia photos? Sheriff Tom listened as I laid out the facts, the camera, the paper, the names, and then he went quiet. "Ethan," he said finally, "sometimes a town keeps its stories like a wound. It won't heal until someone looks at it." We started to look. Mason and I walked the shoreline during daylight. The sheriff widened his questions to include older residents. Mr. Sanford from the hardware store remembered a Jonas, an odd, thin man who had lived on the edge of town. "He was a talker until he wasn't," Mr. Sanford said, tapping a cigarette. "Left one spring and just never came back. Kids push the story into something else because that's what kids do. An elderly woman at the library handed me a brittle postcard with a picture of the bay and a handwritten note on the back. Keep watch, the water remembers. No return address. No writer. The more we dug, the more the bay's memory threaded through people's lives like a river through sediment. There were rumors of a boy who couldn't be found after the boathouse burned, of strange lights sometimes seen over the water at odd hours, of fishermen who swore their lines tugged when no fish were biting. It all felt like a bruise everyone pretended not to see. Night returned, as it always does, with the same impatient certainty. I started sleeping in the living room, the curtains pulled tight, but one night I woke to find the house full of the smell of lake water. Damp, cold, green as algae. My skin prickled. I turned on the light, and the smell seemed to evaporate, like someone had exhaled and left the room. On the kitchen counter lay a small object I didn't recognize. A wooden token, no larger than a quarter, carved with the shape of a wave and streaks of dark residue like the oily hands from the footage. Whoever left it knew where I would see it, or they wanted me to. Sheriff Tom suggested we check the old boathouse ruins up on the northern rim. It was a place people walked past but avoided. A concrete slab, blackened beams that jutted like ribs. We drove out with flashlights and the hush of men leaning on each other's patience. The air up there carried different sounds, the creak of distant trees, the way the water breathed against the rocks. On the slab, we found something. Not recent, not exactly. A cluster of tokens laid in a rough ring, each carved with the same wave. The tokens were weathered, their edges softened by time. Beneath them, in the ash of a long-ago fire, someone had scratched letters into the concrete. Remember. That night, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows until my hands trembled. I tried to sleep and failed. Sometime around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name from the dark of the backyard. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a full sentence. Just my name, low and limpid, pulled through a mouth that seemed to have swallowed a long winter. I sat up hard, heart a trapped bird, listening for the next sound. There was a scraping at the side of the house, like nails over wood, slow and patient. I turned on the lamp and the pool of light showed the glass of the window beaded with condensation despite the cold night air. Written on the outside, traced in the fog, were words I had seen before. Remember water. The scraping stopped. The voice did not come again. Outside, the lake lay flat and unreadable, and somewhere down the shore a gull cried as if in answer. I called Mason, then Abby, then the sheriff, but by the time anyone arrived, there was only the impression of feet in the damp grass and the faint smell of lake under the porch. The wooden token was gone from the counter as if lifted by hands that had never left a trace. The tokens at the boathouse remained, sleep-stitched together in their ring, and the word in the concrete looked like it had always been there, as if the present had slid over history and sealed it. I felt watched in a way that made me small and stubborn at the same time. The town had folded its skirts over an old wound, and I was poking at the scab. Sheriff Tom was both sympathetic and exasperated. He said he wanted to find answers. He also told me to take precautions. Mason suggested we leave for a weekend, get out of town where the air couldn't carry secrets from the bay. Abby pressed another mug into my hands and wouldn't take no for an answer. That night, before I left for Mason's, I walked the pier one last time. The sky was a smear of cloud and the water, black and anonymous, lapped at the pilings. I thought I saw something move under the surface, a shape that was too deliberate to be a fish, a slow arcing shadow. For a moment my breath stopped, and in that silence I heard it again. My name, softer, as if coming from a throat under the water. I turned to run, but my foot caught on something half buried at the edge of the dock. It was a small leather-bound book, its cover scuffed and the pages swollen with lake scent. Inside, handwriting poured across the pages in a neat, slanted script. Names, dates, short lines about tides and children, a line repeated over and over, "She won't let me forget." Underneath the final entry, in a different hand, someone had written, "Tell him the water remembers." The book went in my jacket. I locked the door and left, carrying more questions than I had left that morning. As Mason's headlights pulled us away from the rim, the pier receded into the night, and the concrete teeth of the old boathouse waited in their ruin, patient. Whatever was calling my name had started to write its story into other people's margins. I couldn't tell yet if I was the next sentence or the recorder of an ancient, slow paragraph. But I knew, with a certainty that crawled up my spine, that the lake did not forget, and that whatever remembered it had enough patience to wait for me to notice. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The car hummed like a beast trying to sleep as Mason drove us away from the pier. I had the little leather book folded against my chest like a talisman. The pages smelled of mildew and old paper and something colder, the scent of a place that had held secrets for a long time. We didn't speak much. Mason's radio played some dull talk show, and then he shut it off when I set the book on my knees and opened it to the first page. Jonas Kells's handwriting filled the front. Lines about tides and children and a woman's name written repeatedly, Evelyn. Underneath that, dates that matched a summer in the late 1940s. Scattered between the weather notes were small, perfect drawings of waves and a ring of dots as if someone were trying to map the lake's heartbeat. Then in a different scrawl, a confession that walked like a limping thing. She won't let me forget. Over and over, as if the pen itself had been worn by repetition. Mason read over my shoulder, fingers tracing a line. "You know what this looks like?" he asked, and he didn't wait for my answer. "Obsessive notes. A man losing his way. Could be nothing more than loneliness." His voice tried for reason, but there was an edge to it that sounded like fear. I didn't want to believe the book pointed towards something that could reach out to me, but the tokens, the cameras, the scrap of paper, all of it braided into a single rope pulling at the same thing. We gave the book to Sheriff Tom the next morning. He thumbed the pages like a man reading another man's fever dream. Jonas Kells was a name that drifted in the margins, he said. Caretaker of the old rental, accused of a few things, then gone. Folks closed the book, literally and figuratively. I can ask the county archives for property records, heirs, any living relatives. He put the book in evidence again, but this time his eyes had a steady light to them. It felt like the difference between a man acknowledging a problem and a man resolving to do something about it. The lead that turned things from rumor to pursuit came from an unlikely place. Ruth Meyer, 92 and sharp as a tack, who lived in a small house near the library. Ruth had been a teenager when the boathouse burned. She'd watched from a picnic blanket as men carried away the charred timbers, and she remembered Jonas as someone who loved the lake like a neighbor, she said, adding that he had an odd way of speaking to it. He'd slide little things into the water, she told us, knitting needles idle in her lap. Coins, bits of ribbon. He said the water would tell him secrets if you listened long enough. Ruth's living room smelled like lemon oil and lavender. On her coffee table were album photos, one of them showing a woman with dark hair laughing on a boat. Evelyn, perhaps, and the same scrawl of handwriting on the back. Evelyn, July 47. Her eyes softened and then hardened. Jonas loved her until he couldn't, she said. Then the lake took what it wanted. She folded her hands like someone closing a door no one would open. That night, we walked the northern rim again, flashlights cutting the dark into narrow lanes. The tokens were still there in their ring on the old slab, but now someone had added more, small carved pieces, a rusted locket, a child's shoe sole, a scrap of fabric stuck in a beam. The tokens glinted like a grisly offering. Sheriff Tom collected what he could, bagging each item as evidence. There are patterns, he said, numbers, shapes. Somebody's been arranging these for a long time. I thought it was just one person, Mason said, voice low, but this looks like a ritual. His mouth said the word, but his eyes saw something worse, that other people too conspired with the lake in some private grief. The leather book contained more than confessions. It had entries with names and times and a short phrase, "At high water." One entry included a small sketch, a dock with a cross marked at the edge and the notation, "Evelyn fell. Jonas watched." The writing blurred a little on that page, like someone had paused and forgotten how to finish. We tried to trace relatives. An old census record turned up a Kells descendant living in a farmhouse outside of town, a man named Calvin Kells. Calvin answered the phone like someone who had long ago rehearsed sorrow. He remembered Jonas as an uncle who left when he was a boy and who had talked in circles about apologies to the water. Calvin's voice went flat when I mentioned the tokens. People go there, he said. They leave things. My mother used to say, let them be. But some come back changed. He refused to talk more, and the line clicked dead. As autumn deepened, the town began to split into those who wanted to dig and those who wanted to leave old wounds closed. The local paper ran a small piece. Mysteries of the Bay resurface. Tourists shrugged, long-term residents ate earlier dinners and pulled curtains. But for me, the thin line between history and haunt stretched right through the little leather book and tightened every time I turned a page. Then came the night Mason and I found the rope. We went back to the pier because the book had a notation we'd missed in the heat of earlier panic. A set of coordinates scrawled between entries, almost hidden in a note about tides. It wasn't precise, but it pointed to a shallow inlet a short distance from the old boathouse ruins. We took the boat out at dusk, the lake breathing soft and slow beneath us. The sky bled pink, and for a while it felt like any other night on the bay, the kind that has no meaning until it does. The inlet was shallow and stony. As his motor idled, Mason leaned over the gunwale and pointed toward a bulge at the bottom near an old piling. It looked like a dark knot in the water. I ducked and tied my fingers around it. The rope came up with a wet, dragging sound and a weight at its end. It was wrapped around a rusted metal box. We hauled it into the boat and pried it open with Mason's knife. Inside were old coins, a photograph of a woman with the same dark hair Evelyn, and a small wooden cross. There was also a note, folded thin and soaked with lake water. Forgive me. I couldn't save her. The paper dissolved where my thumb brushed it, the ink bleeding into a new story. I felt the boat tilt with the suddenness of revelation. The lake felt like a thing with ears. Mason looked at me then, face pale. This is getting too close, he said. We should take it to Tom. We did. Sheriff Tom wrapped evidence bags around each item like someone putting bandages on a wound that needed to be seen. If this links Jonas to Evelyn in a way the town remembers but never named, we need to be careful, he said. Human stuff gets ugly fast. So we waited for the lab, for interviews, for background checks. The town went on, coffee, hardware, grocery aisles like a train that refused to stop. I slept less. The voice at the window returned on some nights, softer now, sometimes only a breath of sound like a boat sliding against a piling. The book's page that read, "Tell him the water remembers," felt like a promise we couldn't avoid. Then, at 2:07 a.m., the motion sensor on my back porch tripped. Mason called me, voice frantic. "There's someone out there," he said, "on the cameras. You need to." He didn't finish. The feed showed a figure standing at the edge of my yard, and while the hood hid the face, the hands shone with that same oily gleam. The figure lifted something and tossed it toward the house. It landed with a thud on the porch. The motion sensor caught it as it rolled. A leather-bound book, identical to the one I'd given Sheriff Tom. I opened the door, and the night air smelled of the lake, of cold reeds and something like distant singing. The new book lay where the first had been, soaked and heavy. Inside was a single fresh page, written in a hand that seemed to swim between past and present. "You found what I hid. Now listen. Meet me at the inlet at midnight. Come alone." I stood on the porch, the sentence like a tide pulling me under. Mason's voice on the phone was distant and small. Sheriff Tom told me not to go. Ruth told me not to go. Abby pressed my hand and said, "Please, Ethan. But when you are a man with a name written on the lake's lips, the choice narrows like a limb in a sweater. You either turn away forever or you step closer and find out." At midnight, I climbed into the boat alone. The inlet waited like a mouth. The water gleamed black, and in the hush, a voice, no, a chorus, seemed to lift from nowhere and say my name, softer than memory and twice as old. I tied the rope to the piling, took the flashlight, and pushed off. Halfway across, the beam from my flashlight caught something moving under the surface. Not a fish, not a bobbing wave, something deliberate and slow, tracing the line of the boat like a finger testing skin. My breath shortened. The lake, which until now had held its secrets like a closed fist, began to open. I leaned over and the water answered, warm as a palm, and then my name came up from below, not spoken by a mouth, but by the place itself. It sounded like Evelyn's laugh and Jonas's apology folded into one. I reached for the rope, for the box, for whatever promised closure, and the surface broke with the weight of someone else climbing up through the water toward me. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The shape broke the surface and hauled itself up like something that had been waiting a long time to remember how to walk. Water streamed from the man's coat and hair, and his hands, those same oily, dark-streaked hands, reached for the gunwale as if the boat were a promise. For a heartbeat, I only saw the face in the halo of my flashlight. Thin, knuckled, eyes that held a kind of exhausted apology. He wore no hood. He wore Jonas in the way someone wears a name they cannot change. "You're late," he said, voice rasping like a winter branch. I should have been afraid in a simple, immediate way. Instead, I felt a slow, growing, sickening recognition. This wasn't just some prankster or a frightened neighbor. Time had a hold on him, and the water had taught him to wait. The book in my pocket felt like a bell that could not be unrung. "Who are you?" I asked, because asking seemed to be the polite thing left in the world. He laughed. It was small and broken and almost like a sob. "Who do you think?" "Jonas Kells, of course, or the shell of him. Does it matter? Names are less useful than memory." My knees wanted to fold. The lake lay black and patient around us as if it were listening in. "Jonas is," I began. "Jonas is dead." "Am I?" He pushed his wet hair from his face. The eyes were old eyes in a young face and young eyes in an old one. Depends on what you mean by dead. My body left, maybe. But what kept me walking never left. The part of me that remembers the sound of her laughter, the slip of her wrist, the heat of the boathouse, that part keeps me here like a stone keeps a ring. "Where's Evelyn?" The question came out more urgent than I'd meant. For months, a name had echoed through torn pages and tokens. For months, I had been carrying other people's grief like a borrowed jacket. Jonas's face softened at the name, and for a moment the man on my boat became less monstrous and more heartbreak. A boy begged to be forgiven. "She is where water keeps what it takes," he said. "Not gone, Ethan. Kept. The town hid things because revealing them would topple other things they liked to believe about themselves. I loved her. I failed her. And the lake." He looked away as if embarrassed to say the word. "The lake does not forget." He told a story then, not of a villain, but of a man who had been undone. There had been a picnic, the boathouse lit with lanterns, and someone had been careless with a match. Evelyn slipped on a wet board. He had been drunk that evening. The old photographs had suggested gatherings with cheap whiskey and loud men, and he had tried to grab her, but his hands had been useless. He had watched her go under in a blink, and had woken in the cold dawn to the smell of smoke and the town's quick, practical forgetting. They had given him drink and pity, and then barred the corners where truth might grow. "I didn't push her," he said when my silence grew too heavy. "I failed to pull her up. And then I walked away and let the town make the story something softer. Living here is a series of small betrayals to the dead." If part of me wanted a confession that would land clean and make the rest of the story simple, that part found no purchase. What stood in front of me was not the kind of demon you could fight with a flashlight or a call to the sheriff. This was a wound that had turned inward until it learned to speak. "You left the tokens," I said. "The ring at the boathouse. Why leave them?" "For company." His laugh was kinder now, and a promise. I thought if I left them, they'd be answered. I thought the town would answer with a truth that would let me rest. Instead, they answered with hushes. So I kept bringing things, and then others came, children who found the old stories and thought they could add their names. A lot of people love the lake enough to keep rituals for it without needing an altar. I could see in the way his hands trembled that some part of Jonas wanted absolution. "Tell me what you want," I said. "And I mean it, not tricks." He looked at me long enough that I thought he might refuse, and then he tipped his head back and the moonlight cut his face into something almost human. "Tell them," he said. "Tell the town the way it was. Read what I wrote in that book. Tell them Evelyn didn't just wander off. Tell them I tried and I failed. Throw the tokens back into the inlet where the things were hidden. Not because that will bring her back. No, be honest. But because forgetting is a cruelty, and remembering might be the only small kindness left." It was easier to imagine a confrontation of fists and shouts than it was to imagine standing in a town hall and reading a confession. But Jonas's contract with the water had one clause I couldn't ignore. The lake wanted names spoken aloud. It wanted memory made public. I brought the boat back to the dock in a clumsy, shaking slide. We took the box and the soaked photographs and the cross back to Sheriff Tom. I stood in the fluorescent light of the station while judges in the town filed their grocery lists and the sheriff read from the leather book, his voice even as if reciting minutes of a small, ordinary meeting. He read about the picnic, the boathouse, the flash of fire. He read Jonas's entries about tides and guilt, and the repeated line, "She won't let me forget," until the room settled around the words like a new dust. People asked questions. Old excuses clattered like tin. Some eyes hardened and some softened. Calvin Kells came down from his farm and sat in the back with his hands in his coat. Ruth Meyer nodded when the sheriff spoke. Abby's hand found mine in the crowd and squeezed. Mason stood with his chin set like a man who had given himself to watchfulness. We didn't have a trial. We didn't need one. The town didn't have the kind of power to reverse decades of omission. But whatever it was that had let Jonas walk the shoreline and leave tokens and whisper names had to be answered with something other than silence. We held a small, wet ceremony on a gray morning at the old boathouse, where the ash was still a faint memory in the concrete. People came with coins and trinkets and notes. Some left in silence, a few cried. Sheriff Tom read the names we had found, Evelyn's among them. And then, when the list was done, we threw the tokens into the inlet and watched them sink. Jonas did not stand among us. He had slipped back into the trees that morning before dawn. Later, Mason and I found a folded scrap inside the leather book. A note in a shaky hand. "Forgive me," it said. "I go to the place I failed. Let the water have me if it will. Tell her I'm sorry." We never found a body. Whether Jonas drowned himself or wandered away and became a story for other people to find, I never learned. But after that morning, the nights felt different. The motion sensors on my porch stopped tripping. The scraps of paper stopped appearing on the table. The ring of tokens remained at the bottom of the inlet like a bruise in slow healing. Sometimes at dusk, I still walk the pier. The lake breathes the same indifferent air. Every now and then, I think I hear a laugh in the surf. Evelyn's, maybe, or the memory of it. Memory is an odd thing. It can bind and it can release. That last October, the town chose for a moment to wear its inconvenient truth like a shawl instead of hiding it in a closet. Whether that was compassion or fear, I leave to the listener. All I know is that saying the names, letting people remember, changed something. As for me, I keep Jonas's little leather book in a drawer. I write in it sometimes, not to summon anything, but to prove that remembering is a work you can do with your hands. When the wind comes off West Bay, sharp and clean, I think of Evelyn and the way a laugh can survive decades and 100 forgettings. I think of the thin man at the inlet who taught me that the lake does not only take, sometimes it insists we pay attention. If there's a moral, maybe it's this. Towns are made of stories, and stories, once unearthed, have to be treated with care. They are not ours to fold away. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Grady. I was 34 years old when it happened, on the night of October 18th, 2019, in Traverse City, Michigan. Say that aloud if you like. Dates have a way of anchoring the blood in your veins. I tell this as a man who survived something I still cannot fully explain, and I tell it because telling keeps the dark from growing teeth in the corners of quiet rooms. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me tell you the parts around it. The who, the why, the where. Because stories like this don't come from nowhere. They grow from small choices, familiar faces, and towns that hold their own memories, like knotted rope. Traverse City looks like postcard tranquility if you've only seen the summer pictures. Sailboats, cherry orchards, a downtown that smells faintly of coffee and lake air. But come October, when the tourists thin and the nights sharpen, the town leans in on its own history. Locals nod to one another about old buildings and old grudges, the same way fishermen nod to weather patterns. I lived in a 2-story clapboard house off Garland Street, a quiet stretch where porches still had rocking chairs and wives waved to neighbors. I worked as a night manager at the Old Lantern Inn, a small boutique hotel that rebuilt itself on the shell of something older. It paid the bills and fed my tendency to watch people. I liked to learn their stories. It was easier than telling my own. People in Traverse City have names thick with story. There was Lila Monroe, who ran the bakery 2 blocks from my house and made cinnamon rolls so addictive, a police sergeant once claimed she should be taxed. Lila is the reason I still believe kindness matters. She brought me soup when I was sick and listened to me complain about nothing until my complaints sounded petty. Evan Shaw lived next door, a retired school teacher who kept his yard immaculate and his privacy guarded. Evan's daughter, Mara, was the first to point out the broken light on our street last winter and then go on to study environmental science at the university. She waved at me with a steadiness that suggested she could be trusted. At the Old Lantern Inn, the regular staff were characters out of a long-running play. Julio, the chef, loud, precise, and fond of arguing about folklore at closing time. Ada, the front desk clerk, who'd calm any guest's nerves with a single uncanny joke. And Sheriff Alan Brooks, who wasn't a staff member exactly, but who came by on quiet Tuesday mornings to drink coffee out of the inn's chipped mugs and discuss ordinance changes like they were the weather. There were guests, too. Always a parade of faces, some weary, some celebratory, some carrying their own half-broken stories in suitcases. Why I was there that October night is not a romantic reason. I had been working double shifts to save for a small house repair, the kind that creeps up on you, guttering, a roof shingle here, a furnace check there. Money tight, I took extra hours at the inn, letting the hum of other people's lives soothe the edges of my own. The day had been slow. The lake had been flat, a glassy mirror under a pale sky. We had one big reservation that weekend. A reunion of a small high school class booked the entire top floor. They were loud, but the walls at the inn bent politely around noise. Traverse City in mid-October has a smell. Leaf-littered, a trace of wood smoke, the ghost of apple orchards. People said it keeps town secrets safe because the wind is always half cold and the nights come on sharp. I didn't think much about secrets then. I was practical. I liked schedules. But there is a habit in quiet towns of accepting peculiarities. An abandoned boathouse with a broken hinge, a stretch of road where the fog seems to linger longer, a houseboat that rocks gently though the water is flat. You notice these things and tuck them away in the same pocket where you hide your spare change. What I didn't know were the small fractures under the placid surface of that October. There had been rumors. Nothing official, just gossip over pie in the bakery or a note in the town's Facebook group. People mentioned strange lights along the old Mott Road, a man seen pacing the fringe of the Cherrywood Preserve at dawn, an old asylum rock someone swore they heard singing from when the wind was right. These were the kinds of stories that made you roll your eyes and then, later that night, wonder if you should have paid more attention. There were also personal tensions, the kind that sharpen when money and history collide. The Old Lantern Inn had been in a mild dispute with a developer who wanted to convert the adjacent lot into high-end condos. The developer, a man named Roland Pierce, had a reputation for being both charming and ruthless. He showed up at town meetings with a smile and left with parcels of land. People who cherished the inn's old charm feared what Pierce might do. His trucks were sometimes seen idling by property lines after dark. We had received a terse legal notice 2 months earlier. The inn's owner, Marjorie Kent, had kept it hidden from guests, but confided in me over a whiskey that she felt watched. Then there were the small human currents. A late-night argument between 2 guests. I overheard shouts and slammed doors in the hallway. The hotel cat Nebo, who disliked men with loud shoes. A janitor who found a keyhole in a door that no one had cataloged. Life was a stack of small events, each insignificant on its own. But as every old storyteller knows, small things aggregate into a pattern until they look deliberate. I tell you their names because to tell a true horror is to give it a human backbone. The people matter. The place matters. The date matters. On October 18th, 2019, all of these things were pressing against one another like bodies in a crowded room. We had a thunderstorm pass through at dusk, wind that tossed leftover leaves in dizzy circles down Front Street. The inn hummed with the insulated quiet of guests who had eaten early and retired. I was supposed to be checking the northeastern wing after midnight, a rote chore I'd done 100 times. Lock a side door, confirm the boiler was stable, make sure the fire doors latched. I won't lie, I felt a thread of unease as I made my rounds. Maybe it was the way the storm had left the air too clean, or the silence after the reunion's laughter died down. Maybe it was because the inn's lights felt too bright against the dark, like an eye open where it shouldn't be. Maybe it was nothing at all, and telling this is my way of turning a shrug into meaning. Around 11:42 p.m., after I had checked the boiler and read the maintenance log, a scribbled note about a missing wrench, I paused in the rear corridor. The old lantern's wooden floors creaked in a way that felt like breath. Then I heard the first sound that pulled the evening out of routine. An odd clinking, like keys brushing a rail coming from the stairwell that hung behind the old service elevator. It was faint, then persistent, and beneath it, almost drowned, was a sound like someone whispering to themselves. This is where I start the part you asked me not to rush to. The actual event, the thing that wound itself into me like ivy into mortar. But I promised you'd get the main story after I'd set the scene. So here, now, the night opened up in a way ordinary nights never do, and the town I thought I knew showed me a face I couldn't have imagined. The clinking became footsteps, slow and deliberate, and as I moved toward the stairwell, every practical instinct told me to turn on the light and call a coworker. Instead, curiosity, or something else, made me step into the shadow. The story begins there, with me and a stairwell and a sound that would not be shrugged away. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The stairwell swallowed the light. My hand found the rail, cool, varnished, a steady line I could follow. The clinking stopped when I reached the landing. For a moment I tasted metal and winter apple on the air, a clean, sharp thing that had nothing to do with the storm. The whispering folded around me like a draft and then consolidated into a single voice, low and careful, as if whoever spoke was practicing words that didn't want to be said aloud. "Help me," it said. My mouth tasted of iron. "Help me." 2 words that set my entire nervous system to answering. I wasn't brave in the heroic sense. Bravery for me has always been a ledger. Responsibilities, checks, a pulse on what's owed. But help me is a ledger that opens and looks right at you. I stepped down, foot on the squeak of the 3rd stair, and peered into the dim of the service corridor that curved around the old freight elevator. The light switch refused to click. I pressed harder until the bulb hummed and threw thin yellow across the peeling wallpaper. The corridor seemed longer than I remembered. There was no one visible, just the discarded footprints of a late-day cleaner and a damp smear that might have been a handprint on the carpet. But the whispering had a direction now, a pull toward the basement door at the corridor's end. Basements are repositories of old things, trunks, lost receipts, the dead ends of stories. Ours had an equipment room, and behind it a smaller door I'd always assumed led to a storage crawl. Tonight, however, the door was ajar. A thin sliver of darkness leaked from its edges like ink. On a bench nearby lay a brass key, its teeth nicked, as if it had been used by someone who was in a hurry. The key was warm. I should have taken a photo. I should have called Ada or Julio. Instead, I did what storytellers always regret. I picked it up and opened the door. The room beyond smelled of dust and lemon oil and something older, a faint metallic tang like pennies rubbed together. Light from my phone ran along stacked crates and a sagging tool cabinet. Then my beam caught a small figure curled in the corner. Someone too thin to be a guest, wrapped in a hotel throw, face hidden in their arms. "Hey," I said, and the words seemed to crack the air. The person lifted their head. Eyes like a drowned storm looked back at me. They were young, maybe in their early 20s, and their hair was cut too short on one side as if someone had taken a knife. A smear of dark across their cheek could have been soot or blood. From where I stood, I couldn't tell. "You shouldn't be here," they whispered, but not from fear. From a kind of exhaustion that runs deeper than any one night. "Who are you?" I asked. The question sounded absurd. Names get stolen in broken buildings. They push themselves up slowly. The hotel throw fell away and a flash of a logo on their sweatshirt hit me. A university bookstore seal, the same one Mara had mentioned in passing last week. Mara? I wanted to call out, but the name didn't belong to this person. I forced myself to be practical. "Are you okay? Did someone—" "They took my light," the person said, and it was an odd turn of phrase until I realized they meant the small LED flashlight clipped to their belt. "Phone's dead. Key's gone. Their voice frayed. "I think I came back, but the doors changed." People tell you in movies and in barstool arguments that buildings can be tricky at night. Real buildings are made of timber and contractors' shortcuts and human memory. They don't change. People do. Yet standing there with a kid in my lobby, I felt the world rearrange like cards in a sleight of hand. We sat on the concrete bench, and I draped my jacket over their shoulders, feeling the tremor beneath the bones. "I'm Thomas," I said, and my name felt like a bridge. "You're safe here. Who else is?" They swallowed and exhaled slow. "I was with the reunion upstairs. We went out on the back patio. Something lit these trees up, like lanterns, old lanterns, but moving. People started to laugh and then scream. I ran. I don't remember until now." The words didn't line up, but memory is a broken map. I helped them to their feet and saw in the light that their hands were nicked, and there was a shape of something dug into their palm. A crescent like a nail had tried to mark them. They wouldn't tell me where they'd been. They just looked at me and said, "Don't let them take the light again." "Who?" I asked, too sharp. "Who takes light?" They looked at the key clenched in my pocket, the brass warmth from when I'd handled it. "He does. He likes promises," they whispered. I checked the surveillance footage in the security office, trying to stitch logic to what felt like a dream. The cameras showed glitching static at the West Wing stairs for a few minutes, then a flash, like a reflection off a chrome sign, then nothing. The reunion guests passed in the footage. Older faces, red wine, warm laughter. No one appeared to vanish. Nothing that looked supernatural. The kid, whose name I learned after a long, slow breath was June Rowe, sat down on a dingy armchair and, in the same way a machine that has been restarted needs time to warm, fell apart into words. June said they saw a man by the orchards after midnight. A tall man in a dark coat with a hat that hid most of his face. He'd been standing near the old orchard fence where the developers' trucks had been parked last month. The man had a lamp-like pull in his hands, a light that hung without a visible source. He had asked for promises, June said. Promises with names. He asked June for a name, and when June refused, the man had smiled and June had run. At the inn, rumors coagulate like oil. People talk and the stories gain sheen. Sheriff Brooks came by with his coffee and his even voice. He believed in property lines and power outages and teenagers who broke into crawl spaces. He listened to my recounting of the night as if cataloging evidence. "We'll check the perimeter," he said. His jaw tightened when I mentioned the developer's trucks. The man, Roland Pierce, had a reputation, and Brooks had the look of someone who'd seen towns fall under charm. "I'll have deputies patrol Cherrywood," he promised. But promises are tricky things at night. That week, the town's talk thread lit up with odd posts. Photos of a lantern suspended in the middle of an empty road, a grainy video of a figure moving through fog near the old asylum ruins, someone swearing they heard music from a place that had been boarded for decades. People were spooked. They called it the Traverse Flicker on a local message board, like a joke. Jokes are sometimes how communities process fear before it blooms. That night, I slept in my small living room armchair because caution had become a habit. At 2:13 a.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. No one spoke, only a breath, low and deliberate, and then the click of a lighter and the smell of smoke through my line. I sat frozen until the call cut. In the morning, the inn's back gate had been unlocked, and the earth under the chain link showed prints, small and erratic, as if someone had knelt and spun in place. The thing about terror is how patient it is. It doesn't roar like a movie monster. It taps. It writes in margins. It asks questions politely and then waits until your back is turned to rearrange the furniture of your certainty. Over the next few days, more people reported similar nights. Odd lights hovering over the bay, muffled singing beneath their windows, pets acting strange and staring at corners that held only plaster. Marjorie, who owned the inn, refused to take guests off the books. "We keep our lights on," she said, but she no longer walked the back corridors at night alone. I started keeping a small notebook. Each entry was a stitch. June's missing time, the key from the bench, the whisper at the stairs. I made a list of questions and crossed them out when they refused answers. Who was the man with the lamp? What did he mean by promises? Did Roland Pierce's trucks have anything to do with it? On the fourth night after October 18th, I found a scrap of paper tucked into the old lantern's annual ledger. It had once been a hotel receipt, but someone had written on the back in a hurried hand, "Not the inn, the light under the orchard. Do not answer his name." Below it, a word circled 3 times, "Lumen." I slept less after that. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I kept a running tally in my head of nights that never felt like nights anymore. 7 since October 18th. 7 times the town woke with a bruise it couldn't explain. 7 times I asked myself if I had the right to pry into things that smelled of old promises and new money. But curiosity is a bad landlord. It charges rent whether you can afford it or not. And by the time the ledger of oddities had 3 pages, I had paid in more than coffee and sleeplessness. The scrap with lumen underlined in my mind like an accusation. Latin words have a way of making local gossip feel like a conspiracy. I started at the library, where Mrs. Lafferty, the head librarian, had ruled the archives for 30 years and treated every old town rumor like a misfiled book. "You want the nothing new in Traverse file?" she asked when I told her threadbare parts of the story. She unlocked the local history drawer, brittle newspapers, property deeds yellowed at the edges, a stack of church minutes. There was the developer's family name in an old article about the Pierce Orchard, and a small notice from 1891 about a lamplighter named Silas Lumen, who tended the orchard's lamps before electricity. Silas had been a minor celebrity in a town that liked its eccentrics. A photograph showed a man with a high-colored coat and eyes like hollows. The caption read, "Silas Lumen, orchard keeper and light keeper. Local legend, kept watch over lost travelers." There were also marginalia, a clumsy journalist's aside about a man missing from town for a week in 1903, found at the asylum with his hands scorched and his mouth full of moth wings. The article used the word promise. The town had buried odd things like knickknacks, but the same names appeared along the margins, as if someone had traced the same pattern for a century. Orchard, lamp, promise. If a pattern exists, I thought, it is either a superstition or an instruction. I chose to treat it like both. Sheriff Brooks' deputies drove slow and courteous when I mentioned Lumen, as if a Latin-rooted name could upset the evidence room. Roland Pierce, I discovered, had ancestors who owned much of the land around Cherrywood. Pierce himself was a man built from polished surfaces. He wore tailored coats and always smelled faintly of citrus. When I asked him if he knew anything about the old lamplighter, he smiled the way a cat does before it decides whether you'll be breakfast. "History is useful," he said, leaning into a privacy I hadn't offered. "Charms the tourists. My great-grandfather lit those lamps, I suppose. People romanticize what they don't understand." He wandered his words like stones in a pond. "Why are you interested, Thomas? You prefer the inn to the archives." My question hung because I had no legal ground to stand on. I did, however, have June Rowe and a key that had been warm in my pocket. I had a kid on a cot in the back office who sometimes drifted out mid-sentence and seemed to be missing hours like teeth. I had a town that blinked at empty corners. I started watching the orchards. The air was sharp with rotting fruit and cold seep. The trees looked like hands stretched into an exhausted sky. I went at dusk because if there is a thing that pretends to be a story, it prefers the hour between work and bed. I brought a flashlight and an old brass lantern Marjorie had given me after I'd complained about the inn's antique fixtures. She had said, "If anything weird starts, take this. It's silly, but it's metal." I laughed then, but the lantern felt like a talisman in my hands that night. The first time the lamps appeared, they were small, like the glow from a cheap bulb. They hovered between tree limbs, impossibly steady, as if hung on threads no eye could see. I felt a tug in my stomach like hunger. I took a step forward and a single lamp dimmed, then brightened, and the whispering started again, a chorus that sounded like the rustle of leaves and a voice saying, "Name. Name." The same question I'd heard in the stairwell. Who are you? Who do you owe? Who do you promise? The idea of promises made me think of exchanges, names for safeties, light for warmth, like trades where one party loses more than the other remembers. I wasn't the only one watching. Evan Shaw, the retired teacher with a yard that looked like a library, showed up 2 nights later carrying a thermos and a small brass bell. "I taught history," he said, as we both crouched under the same gnarled apple tree. "You don't forget what things men sign with their names." His face was a map of worry. He had found in a probate file an affidavit signed by a Lumen descendant in 1932, promising the orchard light to anyone who would keep watch until the town is whole. The language was loopy, like a will written by a hand that had drunk to drown its sorrows. Evan's brows thinned. "The clauses are weird, Tom. It reads like a bargain." On the fourth watch, the lights moved like a school of lantern jellyfish, orbiting something in the deeper patch of trees. We followed them to an old stone well half swallowed by roots, a place I had kicked by accident as a kid and found nothing but mud. Tonight, the well had a sheen on it like mica, and the bells of the lamps hummed. I crouched and peered into the dark and saw, as if projected on the black water, a face that wasn't mine and yet felt like it could be measured against my bones. It was June's face, but older, eyes empty, and when I blinked, the water was only black. The world had learned a new trick. It could flirt at the edges of perception and make you doubt whether you'd seen anything true. "We shouldn't be here," Evan whispered, and his voice cracked like old wood. Something moved behind us, a rustle not of wind but of clothing, the soft scrape of a long coat. We turned and saw a shape, the silhouette of a man tall enough to make the apple tree bow. He stood between the lamps and the well and did not move when we stepped forward. He wore a hat that swallowed his brow and a coat that fell like a curtain. In the lantern light, his face was a smear of possibility. He raised one hand and a small, bright pinprick appeared at his palm. Not a light, but the absence of it, a hole of intensity that pulled the air into itself. "Promises," he said, and the word had a taste like unripe fruit. His voice was wrong. It wasn't quite human, but it fit our language like a patchwork doll. "You keep the promise, and the light keeps you. You do not, and the light." He tilted his head, and the lamps flickered like candles in a breath. Evan made a sound. He should have run. He didn't. He had that habit of teachers to insist on facts in the face of myth. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man laughed, and the sound rustled the leaves. "Names don't matter much to us," he said. "We take what warms. There are things in the dark that negotiate. They are polite until you prove you won't be." As if on cue, the lamps swung toward Evan, and a tug sounded in the air like a low, hungry moan. He stumbled and reached for me. "Tom," he said, like someone calling the name of a child in a crowded room. "Promise. Promise." I realized with a coldness that my mouth tasted like metal. The man wanted a name, an agreement, the kind of trivial oath we make without thinking. I had been wild with promises all week. Promises to check locks, to call the sheriff, to keep June safe. They seemed insufficient as the lamps leaned in. I did the only thing I could. I screamed his name, not mine, not Evan's, but something sharp like a key. "Roland!" I cried, thinking of the developer who'd wandered through town with his citrus smell and smiling bargains. The name landed in the air and landed wrong. The lamps slowed. The man jerked back as if struck. In the hush that followed, Evan collapsed, his hands clawing at his chest. "Tom," he gasped. "You said..." My shout had been an act of desperate logic. There were names tied to the land. There were men who came with suitcases and deeds and names that let them bargain. Perhaps calling Roland's name was a kind of substitution, a reminder that promises aren't free. Someone must pay. Evan's breathing steadied. The lamps dimmed and retreated into the orchard like moths sent home. The man in the hat was gone. In the distance, a vehicle door slammed and someone cursed. Deputy calls drifted through the trees and a flashlight beam landed like a question. I realized then that we'd been seen. We had been exposed. Sheriff Brooks met us at the edge of the orchard with his deputies, stern and practical and very much a man of facts. "What happened?" he demanded. "Light," Evan said, and his voice was a child's. "Promises. He came." Brooks looked from Evan's pale face to me, then to the orchard. Deputy Light swept the trees. "There are squatters in the old orchards," he said. "Kids with bonfires, maybe a couple of pranksters. We'll comb the area in the morning." I wanted to tell him we had seen a man whose voice bent the sky. I wanted to show him the well and the shimmer and the water that carried faces like reflections carry lies. Instead, I nodded, because some things in a community are kept even when the sheriff arrives. Dignity, a belief that some stories are too sharp to bear repeating. That night, I went home with mud on my shoes and the taste of December in my throat. The lantern sat on my table like a promise I could not pronounce. I thought of June and of the bewildered guest curled in my equipment room. I thought of Evan, his fingers still stained with dirt, and the way the orchard had pulled at him with the patience of things that have been waiting a long time. Outside, cherry trees stood like sentinels, their branches quilting the sky. Somewhere under those branches the lamps waited, and the man who liked promises listened. I had the sense then that whatever this was, it had been here before, in other hands with other names. We had disrupted it for a breath, but disruption is a conversation. It doesn't end with it answers. It bargains. It plans. I slept poorly. I woke with a key in my hand and the echo of that hat scraping leaves across my teeth. The town kept breathing, indifferent and beautiful. And I learned there are two kinds of courage, the kind that invites monsters into the light to see their faces, and the kind that stays quiet and protects the ones who cannot sift their memories back into order. I couldn't decide which one I had. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The orchard held its breath the night everything came to a head. I had spent the week piecing together fragments, probate records, old newspaper clippings, sheriff's reports with more blanks than facts. June slept in the back office a lot. Sometimes she would wake and say a single sentence and then drift again. He asks for names. Evan kept to his porch and refused to talk about the lamps. Roland Pierce kept showing up in the town like a scent you couldn't track down. He smiled at community meetings and cut ribbons with thick, clean hands. It felt to me like a story written in invisible ink. The letters were there, but you had to hold them to the light to see. Sheriff Brooks was stretched thin between paperwork and patience. He believed in lines and checks and men who could be found with a warrant. He could not hold what had been waiting in the orchard. So I did the only stupid, sensible thing I could think of. I set a time to go back with people who wouldn't flinch. Evan refused to come. June said she would try if I promised not to leave her side. Marjorie, who owned the inn and who had kept a lamp tucked beside her bed like a relic, insisted on coming too. If this is something that needs an owner, she said, gripping the lamp's handle, I will sit on that bench and not move until morning. We met at midnight. The air had the austere bite of late October and a low fog that made lights smear like watercolor. The orchard that night looked like an amphitheater of skeletal arms. My palms were numb from holding the brass lantern. June's eyes darted to every shadow and then away, as if not to let them catch the movement. Marjorie walked slowly, murmuring old prayers under her breath in a cadence I'd never heard her use before. We reached the old stone well. The lamps hovered like a constellation that had settled in trees instead of sky. This time they weren't timid. They rolled between limbs with a confidence that made my teeth ache. The man was there, waiting as if he'd been appointed to his post in a world where men like him had always existed. He wore the same hat, the same coat that swallowed light. The lamps leaned in toward him like eager hands. He spoke before we had a chance to be anyone but witnesses. You brought a crowd, he said, and the lamps brightened in approval. Children with candles. Marjorie stepped forward, clutching her lamp. Stop, she called. You take from us, return them. He tilted his head. Return? Return what? Promises are kept by remembering. June's hand found mine, cold and shaking. Why names? She asked, voice barely more than wind. Names are anchors, the man answered. They hold. They allow us to borrow light and give in exchange a watch. People do not like to be watched forever, and sometimes they forget to pay their end of the bargain. When they forget, the light grows hungry. You take people, I said. My voice sounded like gravel. You take parts of them. He laughed, a soft and patient noise. We take what is promised. We do not take for sport. I thought of Roland Pierce and the way his family had signed deeds with clean pens. I thought of the affidavit Evan had found that promised the orchard to a descendant who would keep watch until the town is whole. I thought of how bargains, when pushed into law, become teeth. What do you want from us? I asked. He looked at each of us the way a gardener studies plants. When he met my eyes, it felt like a measurement. A name, he said simply. A promise, and someone to remember. That's it, June whispered, so small it could have been anything. That will do, he said, but names must be given with intent. Empty promises choke. I understood then that he was not asking for a trinket. He wanted commitment. Not the casual promises we toss at acquaintances, but the kind that folds into the shape of your life. The light had been baited by contracts and deeds and perhaps by greed. Maybe the Pierces, or their predecessors, had bargained with something they didn't understand. The man with the hat, Silas Lumen, or the thing that had taken his name, had been doing his work for so long that it measured towns by the signatures on paper. Marjorie stepped forward, the lamp in her hand held like a torch. "I will promise," she said. "I will keep watch. I will be named." The man watched her as if seeing a rare resource. "A willing keeper," he said. "That will mend a stitch." "No," I interrupted. "There are other ways. We can set a watch. We can leave food. We can." My words trailed because it suddenly felt like explaining gravity to someone who opened the sky with a hand. Marjorie looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a lifetime of beds to clean and men crying in hallways. "Thomas," she said gently, "we are not all made to hold the things we love. Sometimes you must make a bargain so the town can sleep, so children's laughter returns to streets instead of gutters." There was a silence, heavy and waiting. I thought of June curling on the office cot, of Evan's damp knuckles, of the inn's history like a steady flame. I thought of all the small betrayals towns make to stay comfortable. In the end, I understood the bargain for what it was. Not salvation, but maintenance. Not victory, but a clean table. Marjorie raised her lamp higher. "I promise to keep watch over the orchard," she said, voice steady as an oath. "I will remember, I will name, and I will not forget." The man's lamps pulsed. The air felt like the first cool breath of morning. For a moment, nothing happened but that feeling of things moving into place. Then the lamps began to withdraw, like fish slipping back into deep water. The man's shoulders relaxed as if a weight had been lifted. "You may go," he said to us, "for now." We retreated from the orchard like people leaving a church service. I kept thinking about the word "for now." Promises have expiration dates when made by men with soft voices. The town went back to its routines. Sheriff Brooks increased patrols for a while. Roland Pierce attended fewer meetings, though his trucks kept appearing at property lines. June regained pieces of herself, but the empty hours remained as if someone had cut them out and not yet sewn them back. Evan kept his yard, but no longer went to the library. He walked at dawn and never spoke about the orchard. Marjorie kept her lamp on the bench beside the well for months. People began to leave small things beneath it. Trinkets, notes, a child's toy. I watched the notes and sometimes read them when no one was looking. They said simple things. "We're sorry. We'll remember. We promise." You could see in those folded scraps how people tried to armor themselves against forgetting. As for me, I went back to the inn and to my nights. I kept a ritual of my own, a check of the back gate, a glance toward the orchard when I could. The man with the hat might have been appeased, or perhaps he had simply chosen a new cycle. Maybe promises are a kind of currency we will always use, because they are cheaper than sacrifice. People still tell the story in Traverse City, and it has the shimmer of myth because of how it spreads. Whispered over coffee, exaggerated at the bar, softened in official statements. The truth is smaller and harsher. We made an agreement with an idea, and something that had been waiting accepted it. Some scars healed, others remained as a faint frost on the tongue. The town kept its lamps in the summer months where tourists could photograph them as quaint old fixtures. The well by the orchard grew green with moss, as if the earth wanted to forget the business done above it. June eventually left town for school far away. She called once, voice different, not quite the same as the girl curled in the back room. "Sometimes," she said, "I still taste metal when I wake up, but I'm learning to let memory come back like pages in a book. You helped me, Tom. You held me." I did my best to hold the pieces. Sometimes I dream the man's hat eating the horizon, and sometimes in the quiet after a night shift I hear a lamp hum like an insect, and I count my promises like coins in a pocket. People will ask whether it was real, whether they can chase away something that feeds on names with a town meeting or a prayer. My answer has always been the same. Truth is messy and dependent. We barter what we can for what we need. And if you ever find yourself under an October sky in a town that smells of cherries and old engines, and you see a lamp that doesn't have a source, be careful what you promise. Names are cheap, and the dark is polite until it isn't. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.